For 23 years, the two greatest powers of the Western Mediterranean were locked into a struggle over the control of Sicily. Finally, in 241 BC, after a major naval defeat, the Carthaginians had to sue for peace. The Romans imposed a harsh peace treaty on them, stipulating that Carthage would leave Sicily and pay a hefty sum to the victors. Following the conclusion of the First Punic War, the Carthaginians found themselves in a precarious situation. Having to pay an indemnity to Rome, the Carthaginians were short on money, and they tried to avoid paying their mercenaries. This backfired spectacularly, and their Sicilian veterans, numbering over 20,000, erupted into a revolt. Heavily taxed Libyan communities seized this opportunity and joined the rebellion. The brutality from both sides during the war earned it the moniker Truceless War. On several occasions, the Carthaginians came close to complete collapse, but in the end they prevailed, in large part thanks to the brilliance of one general, Hamilcar Barca. As the war raged on, Hamilcar was gaining favor in the Carthaginian Senate. By the time he brought this war to a close in 238 BC, a significant pro-Barcid faction formed in the Senate, and Hamilcar became the de facto ruler of the city. With the rebellion quelled, Hamilcar could now turn to his ultimate goal, the conquest of Spain. But before this campaign could commence, Hamilcar had to deal with Sardinia. During the Truceless War, the mercenaries on Sardinia rebelled and took control of the island. They appealed to Rome for help, but they were firmly rejected. Left isolated from both sides of the Mediterranean, the mercenaries were expelled from the island by the native population. The Carthaginians were now preparing an expedition to retake the island, but when the Romans got wind of this, they protested and sided with the mercenaries who were now residing in Italy. The Carthaginians were accused of preparing an attack on Italy, and the Romans declared war. The Carthaginians barely survived the recent rebellion, and they were in no position to fight another war with Rome. A delegation was sent to Italy to beg the Romans to reconsider. After some back and forth, the Carthaginians agreed to abandon Sardinia and pay the Romans 1,200 talents. For reference, at the end of the First Punic War, the Carthaginians paid 1,000 talents with a further 2,200 over 10 years. It's unclear why this sudden change of heart from the Romans, but some answers are hidden in the agreed settlement. The loss of Sardinia was a major blow to the Punic naval ambitions. They were now left with only their African ports and a few small islands dotted across the Mediterranean. It's also possible that the Romans feared renewed hostilities in Sicily. If the Carthaginians sent a successful expedition to Sardinia, what was then stopping them from organizing a two-pronged assault on Sicily? The requested indemnity plays into this explanation nicely. The Carthaginians fought wars using mercenaries, meaning they required a lot of money for any prolonged conflicts. Handing over such a large sum would cripple the already weakened Punic economy, and they would be unable to field any large armies for some time. The crisis now averted, Hamilcar was ready for his expedition into Spain. During a ritual ceremony before departure, Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son Hannibal swear an oath to never be a friend to the Romans. Young Hannibal would take this oath to heart, never forgetting the promise made on that fateful day. Hamilcar Barca, accompanied by his son Hannibal and his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, crossed into Iberia in 237 BC. Hamilcar used all Phoenician colonies as a base of operations. He set off from Gades, marching up the Baetis Valley. He crushed all resistance along the way, expanding Carthaginian influence inland for the first time. The defeated troops were offered mercy, and a large part of them joined the Punic army. Crucial silver mines in the west were captured, and newly minted coins started flowing from Gades. The upper Baetis Valley is surrounded by the Sierra Morena mountain range. The Oretani inhabiting these mountains would prove difficult to subdue. For years Hamilcar campaigned in the area, and eventually he decided to move his base to a closer location. He expanded his territory along the coast to the east and founded a new city, Acraleuc. From here he could more easily push inland. During one of his campaigns in the Sierra Morena, Hamilcar was caught in an ambush. At the time his son Hannibal was with him, and Hamilcar sacrificed his life in order to give his son a chance to escape. Hamilcar saved Carthage from the brink of collapse during the Mercenary War. After that, he campaigned in Spain for 8 long years, greatly increasing Punic territory and wealth. Riches coming in from these new holdings enriched Carthage and brought it back to the international stage. Following the death of Hamilcar in 228 BC, his son-in-law Hasdrubal took over command in Iberia. His first order of business was crushing the Oretani, revenging Hamilcar, and finally capturing the rich Sierra Morena mountains. New silver mines were opened, and even more funds started flowing towards Carthage. Hasdrubal was more of a statesman than his predecessor. He used a combination of diplomacy and conquest to expand his territory all the way to the Tagus River. Hasdrubal built a new regional capital in Iberia, Carthago Nova. The splendor of this new city finally attracted Roman attention. Roman envoys were sent in 225 BC to negotiate with Hasdrubal. Neither side wanted another war, and they easily agreed on the new terms. The river Ebro was chosen as a boundary between the Roman and the Carthaginian spheres of influence. Hasdrubal was now free to focus on consolidating power in Iberia. But this wouldn't last long, as Hasdrubal met his end as abruptly as his predecessor. In 221 BC, he put to death one of the Spanish chieftains, only for his loyal followers to break into Hasdrubal's quarters and murder him in his sleep. During his short reign, Hasdrubal proved a capable leader. He consolidated the power Hamilcar acquired in Spain and further expanded Carthaginian influence. During this time, he promoted Hannibal to a cavalry commander, providing him with valuable leadership experience. It was now finally time for the 25-year-old Hannibal to take up the command of the Punic forces. He immediately led a successful campaign in the north. Following this campaign, the tribes south of the river Ebro submitted to the Carthaginians, all except for one. The city of Saguntum had a friendly relationship with Rome. They would periodically send messages to Rome to inform them about Carthaginian activities in Iberia. These messages and the Saguntines were mostly ignored, but now that the Carthaginians expanded all the way to the Ebro, the Romans took notice. In 220 BC, the Romans sent envoys to Hannibal, but they first stopped in Saguntum. The leading men in the city were divided, some of them wanting to join Carthage, while others preferred Rome. The Roman envoys were called in to mediate between the two sides. In clear breach of the Ebro Treaty, the Romans executed the nobles on the Carthaginian side, and Saguntum allied itself with Rome. The Roman envoys then continued on their way and met up with Hannibal in Carthago Nova. Hannibal was well aware of past Roman interferences in Carthaginian affairs and knew what to expect. The envoys, rather than negotiating with the young general, chose a more stern approach. They warned Hannibal not to interfere with Saguntum and to abide by the Ebro Treaty. The Romans weren't trying to provoke war with these requests. Their slow reaction when the war does start is evidence enough. Instead, they only wanted to ensure the obedience of another barked general. This backfired spectacularly, and Hannibal, who had no prior plans to attack Saguntum, informed the envoys that he would in fact take the city and absorb it into the Carthaginian Empire. He deliberately refused to mention Ebro, strongly implying that he had no intentions of respecting the old treaty. Disheartened, the envoys traveled to Carthage to plead with the Senate, but there too they received unsatisfactory answers. Having failed their mission, the envoys returned to Rome and informed the Senate about an imminent attack on Saguntum. Hannibal now asked permission from Carthage to attack the city. The Barcis never before asked permission to wage war in Spain, and the implication was clear. Was Hannibal allowed to risk another war with Rome? He was given a free hand by the authorities in Carthage. These messages were exchanged during the autumn of 220 BC. All necessary preparations were then made during the winter, and Hannibal marched on Saguntum in the spring of 219. Saguntum was a small, well-fortified city positioned on a hilltop. Hannibal hoped to take it quickly before the Romans had a chance to react. This was futile, however, and the Saguntines would hold out for 8 long months. This protracted siege exposed one of Hannibal's weaknesses. Usually a brilliant general, he had trouble taking even small, ally-less towns. This factor may have played a role in his later decision not to siege Rome after the Battle of Cannae. If Livy is to be trusted, Hannibal was wounded by a spear early on in the siege. He was later forced to transfer the siege to his officer Masherbal in order to deal with an uprising of the Aretani and Carpetani. These events just illustrate the precarious position Hannibal found himself in. Eventually, with no Roman help in sight, Saguntum had finally fallen. Part of the wall was breached by battering rams, and the Carthaginians rushed in. Some desperate Saguntines, fearing a fate worse than death, destroyed as many of their possessions as they could before killing themselves and their families. The town was plundered and the population enslaved. Hannibal could now only return to his winter quarters and wait for the Roman response in the spring. Back when the siege started, a message was sent to Rome, but the Romans did nothing, one way or the other. A heated debate arose in the Senate. On one side, a former consul, Lucius Cornelius Lentulus, advocated for a swift military response. On the other side, an unknown member of the Fabii family called for caution. The Roman senators, who usually decided such important matters by consensus, found themselves in a deadlock. Neither side could prevail, and the debates continued throughout the year. It should be noted here that both Roman consuls were currently in Illyria, and recalling one of them to send help to Saguntum would take some time. It was only when Saguntum had fallen that the senators finally agreed, but they would have to wait for spring to send envoys. On the other side of the Mediterranean, Hannibal didn't waste any time. While awaiting messengers from Rome, he was already making preparations for the upcoming conflict. First, he sent 16,000 Spanish troops to Africa and 15,000 African troops to Spain. He believed this would strengthen the bond between the two regions. He appointed his brother Hasdrubal as his deputy, making him second in command. Lastly, he sent spies into southern Gaul and northern Italy. Their task was to sow discontent and prepare the locals for the passage of Hannibal's army. Even from the very beginning, Hannibal had one plan: to invade Italy from the north across the Alps. If he stayed in Spain, he could easily defeat any Roman general, but the lessons learned in the First Punic War were at the forefront of his mind. The Romans had an inexhaustible pool of men, and all losses suffered far from home were easily replaceable. A string of heavy defeats in Spain was unlikely to convince the Romans to surrender. On the other hand, there was a real threat of an African invasion. There was no need to defeat Hannibal when they could simply take Carthage and force them to make peace. This left only one option: to invade Italy and attack Rome directly. The web of alliances holding the Roman state wasn't impervious. The bitter Third Samnite War was still within living memory, and so was the conquest of Magna Graecia. Not to mention Cisalpine Gaul, conquered only a couple of years ago. Hannibal believed that quick victories on the field would turn Rome's own allies against them. When spring of 218 BC finally rolled around, the Romans sent a delegation to Carthage. The delegation was stacked with former consuls, 5 in total, including both consuls of the previous year, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Marcus Livius Salinator. The head of this delegation was Quintus Fabius Maximus. These 3 men will all have important roles to play in the upcoming conflict. The Romans demanded that Hannibal be handed over if he was acting of his own accord. Conversely, the Romans were instructed to declare war. Carthaginians had no intention of handing over Hannibal, and one of the senators pointed out that Saguntum was south of the Ebro and wasn't a part of any treaty. Furthermore, they pointed out the illegal takeover of Sardinia some years ago. At a loss for any coherent arguments, Fabius grabbed his toga and proclaimed, "Gentlemen, I hold in the folds of my toga both peace and war. Which should I let drop?" The Carthaginian suffet said only, "Whichever you prefer." Letting his toga fall, Fabius simply answered, "I give you war." The senators unanimously erupted into a deafening shout, "We accept it!" And so the two nations were once more at war with each other. In the past, historians were quick to blame the Barcid family for the outbreak of the Second Punic War. They even go as far as saying that Hamilcar devised the plan to invade Italy from the north, and that his campaigns in Iberia were meant to facilitate that plan. However, more recently, historians shied away from the great man history and looked at other broader factors for the outbreak of the war. The Spanish campaign was simply a means for the Carthaginians to rebound from the heavy losses sustained during the First Punic War. Waging a new war with Rome would require great naval strength, but the state of the Carthaginian navy in 219 is a clear sign that the Barcids weren't planning on a direct confrontation with Rome so soon. Roman interference in Iberia certainly provoked the Carthaginian response, but it cannot be claimed with certainty that either side premeditated this war. Whatever the case may be, war was upon them, and the two great powers of the Western Mediterranean were embarking on yet another lengthy conflict that would cost countless lives. In 218 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Tiberius Sempronius Longus were elected consuls. 6 Roman legions were raised, with as many Latin alii. Each legion consisted of 4,200 infantry and 300 cavalry. The alii had more troops than usual, owing to a greater perceived threat from the Carthaginians. Scipio was assigned 2 legions along with 14,000 allied infantry and 1,600 cavalry. He was sent to Spain to deal with Hannibal directly. His colleague Sempronius was also assigned 2 legions with 16,000 allied infantry and 1,800 cavalry. He was sent to Sicily in order to invade Carthage itself. The remaining 2 legions, along with 10,000 allied infantry and 1,000 cavalry, were placed under the command of Imperator Lucius Manlius Vulso. He was sent to Cisalpine Gaul to deal with the rebelling Gauls. In addition to these troops, Sempronius was assigned 160 quinqueremes, while Scipio got the remaining 60. All told, the Romans had around 71,000 troops in early 218 BCE. On the other side, Hannibal had 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 58 elephants in total. Of these, only 26,000 would cross the Alps. Hasdrubal was given 15,000 troops and 21 elephants to hold Spain. He was also given 50 or so quinqueremes they had in Iberia. With the rest of the troops, numbering 87,000, Hannibal would march out of Carthago Nova. For all his preparations during the winter, Hannibal was slow to act in the spring. War was declared in March. Hannibal got the news in early April, but he only moved in late May. After crossing the Ebro, Hannibal spent valuable time and resources fighting obscure Iberian tribes. He made no moves against the Greek colony Emporion, a Roman ally and a starting point for a future Spanish campaign. 7,000 troops died in the fighting and 10,000 Celtiberians returned home. An army of 11,000 was left to guard this new territory, leaving Hannibal with around 59,000 troops. By now it was already early September and the winter was fast approaching. These unnecessary delays, more than anything else, puzzled historians. But if we look more broadly, they can be easily explained. If the Romans learned of his plan to invade Italy, they could simply wait for him on the other side and crush his exhausted army. To avoid this, Hannibal's movements had to be perfectly timed. After learning that Scipio started marching north and Sempronio south, Hannibal set off from Carthago Nova. An unexpected rebellion in Cisalpine Gaul, sparked by Hannibal's own agents, delayed Scipio until late August. During this time, Hannibal busied himself in northern Iberia. When Scipio finally started moving again, so did Hannibal. After realizing that he would have to face only one consular army, he could afford to leave 20,000 men behind. As we have already mentioned, the Gauls, or more precisely the Boii and Insubres, rebelled. Manlius Vulso was sent to deal with this threat, but he was ambushed while marching north and had to retreat to a fortified position. Scipio, who was in Pisa making preparations to sail to Spain, had to postpone his departure. Part of his force, 1 legion and 5,000 allies, was diverted to aid Vulso. Scipio had to raise fresh troops, delaying his departure until late August. When he was once again finally ready, he sailed from Pisa along the French coast and toward Spain. In the meantime, Sempronius reached Lilybaeum and started making preparations for the invasion of Africa. Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees with 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. From there, he continued his march along the coast. The Carthaginians sent gifts to the local Gallic tribes, thus securing a safe passage across the southern Gaul. Hannibal, confident in his abilities, was more than happy to meet Scipio on the field. If he destroyed the Roman army now, he would not only secure Spain, but also weaken the Roman position in northern Italy. Once Hannibal reached the river Rhone, he marched his troops 4 days upstream, looking for a favorable crossing spot. The Gauls on the western side offered him assistance and helped him build rafts to ferry the troops across the river. Unfortunately, the Gauls on the eastern shore of the river were not inclined towards the Carthaginian army. They formed up along the river, preventing Hannibal from crossing. Hannibal sent a part of his force to march even further north in order to find another crossing spot. The men crossed the river and marched back south towards the Gallic army. In the early morning, they sent a signal to Hannibal, who started crossing with his men. The Gauls once again formed up to meet him, but when they were attacked from the north, they quickly relented and fled from the field. Hannibal could now direct the crossing of the rest of his force. The river was 60 meters wide, and the Carthaginians had no large ships that could safely carry the elephants. They built a makeshift pontoon bridge and covered it with dirt. The movements of the water scared some animals and they jumped into the river. Eventually, all 37 elephants safely crossed to the other side. 38,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry crossed the Rhone with Hannibal, a notable decrease considering only limited resistance in Gaul. By that time, Scipio reached Massalia, a Greek colony and Roman ally. There he got the news that the Carthaginians were crossing the river upstream. Scipio disembarked, and while making preparations for the march north, he sent a scouting party. Along the way, they intercepted the Carthaginian scouts and the two sides clashed. The Roman cavalry came out on top and they could safely observe Hannibal's camp. After receiving this information, Scipio started marching north with only limited supplies. By the time he reached Hannibal's camp, the Carthaginians were long gone. Evidently, the Punic general had a change of heart. Winter was approaching and time was of the utmost essence. Instead of facing Scipio directly, Hannibal chose to march even further upstream and then towards the Alps. He was confident in Hasdrubal's ability to hold Spain against the Romans. Furthermore, Hannibal received a delegation of chieftains from Cisalpine Gaul. They assured him of Gallic assistance once he crossed into Italy. This was enough to convince him to continue his march without first dealing with Scipio. The Romans, on the other hand, unable to supply this large army so far from the coast, decided to return to Massalia. In this crucial moment, Scipio had to make an important decision that would impact the rest of the war. He sent his older brother, Scipio Calvus, along with the entirety of the army into Spain. He himself returned to Italy and started raising another army in preparation of Hannibal's invasion. During his march, Hannibal intervened in a struggle for kingship over a Celtic tribe. This endeared him to the new king Berneus, and the Celts supplied the Punic army with both food and warm clothes needed for crossing the Alps. Continuing on their way, the Carthaginians now reached the territory of the Allobrogis. These were hostile people, but they refrained from attacking the Carthaginians, while Berneus and his men were shadowing them. Hannibal finally reached the foot of the Alps and started his long and perilous ascent. Berneus didn't follow them up the mountain, and the Allobrogis started harassing the Carthaginian column. The journey up the mountain was hard as it was, but frequent raids put a further strain on the army. Luckily, the rear guard, made up of heavy African troops, held their ground against any larger attacks. Finally, after 9 long days, Hannibal reached the summit of the pass. The location of this pass is still hotly debated, and we will probably never know the true path Hannibal took over the Alps. The attack now stopped, and the Carthaginians faced another, even fiercer enemy, the elements. It was mid-November by now, and fresh snow was already starting to build up along the path. With the morale of the army at a low point, Hannibal gave a rousing speech. He pointed towards the rich and fertile plains of northern Italy, assuring his men of great riches awaiting them on the other side. The journey down was even more perilous. Numerous obstacles blocked their path, but eventually, utterly exhausted, the army reached flat ground. Out of the 87,000 troops Hannibal had left Carthago Noa with, only 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry reached Italy. Miraculously, around 30 elephants crossed the mountains successfully. During a long march across unfriendly territory, desertions were all too common. The fresh recruits were the first to go, leaving Hannibal with mostly seasoned troops, veterans of numerous Spanish campaigns. These veterans and a high number of cavalry would play crucial roles in the upcoming battles. The delay Scipio made while preparing to cross into Spain bought enough time for Hannibal's army to thin out. These delays did more to weaken Hannibal's position in Italy than Scipio's military campaigns ever could. Hannibal found himself in the territory of a Gallic tribe, the Taurini. They were currently engaged in a war with the nearby Insubres and were unwilling to aid Hannibal with either troops or supplies. He decided to send a message to all Gauls south of the Alps by capturing and destroying their chief town. The winter supplies stored in the town would ease Hannibal's troubles for the time being. He could finally allow his troops to rest and prepare for the upcoming battle with the Romans. While resting, Hannibal received word that Scipio was in the area leading a large army. It was uncommon for the Roman consuls to abandon their troops, so Hannibal expected an entire consular army bolstered with additional troops from the area. In order to lift the morale of his men, Hannibal staged a strange ceremony. The Allobrogian prisoners, captured during the crossing of the Alps, were offered a chance to fight for their freedom. The Gallic warriors jumped at this opportunity, and a pair of them were chosen at random. The 2 men fought to the death in full view of the Carthaginian army. Ultimately, the victor was awarded a horse and a weapon and set free. This was meant to show the soldiers that they too had limited options. They could either win their freedom in battle or die trying. Following this display, Hannibal gave a rousing speech, promising his soldiers lands, money, and even Carthaginian citizenship once they had defeated the Romans. With this, Hannibal started moving down the northern bank of the Po River towards Scipio, who was marching up the river to meet him. During his march, Scipio crossed a tributary of the Po, the river Ticinus, by building a pontoon bridge. Once his army was safely across, his scouts informed him of Hannibal's movements. The 2 generals now encamped, fortifying their positions. On the next day, Scipio led a large scouting party with all his cavalry. They were supported by velites, lightly armored skirmishers. Hannibal was leading a party of his own. Riding with most of the Punic cavalry, he vastly outnumbered the Romans. When the 2 armies stumbled upon each other, Scipio, remembering his recent victory in Gaul, decided to ignore the numerical disadvantage and attack Hannibal. He prepared his troops for battle. Velites were placed in the front, with cavalry forming up behind them. The plan was for the velites to throw their javelins into incoming troops and then retreat back to safety, clearing the ground for the cavalry charge. Hoping to win an early victory, Hannibal accepted the challenge. He placed his heavy Spanish cavalry in the center, while his lighter and faster Numidian cavalry was split into two groups and placed on the wings. When the Carthaginians approached, Scipio abandoned his plan and charged through the first line with his cavalry. The confused velites retreated while the two sides clashed. Fighting was fierce, but neither side was giving ground. With the center of both armies now preoccupied, the Numidians swept around the flanks. One wing chased down the still scattered skirmishers, while the other charged the Roman rear, throwing it into disarray. In this confusion, Scipio was badly wounded. He was only saved by the bravery of his young son, who charged into the thick of things and dragged him out. This was none other than Scipio Africanus, the savior of Rome and Hannibal's greatest rival, but this was still many years before the two men would face each other. The Romans now retreated back to camp, suffering heavy casualties in the process. Hannibal didn't press his advantage, expecting a full-scale battle the next day, but during the night, Scipio and his men retreated back across the Ticinus. 600 men stayed behind to destroy the bridge, and they were captured by the Carthaginians. Unable to follow the Romans, the army had to march back upstream to find a place where they could cross the Po. Scipio retreated towards the Roman colony of Placentia, where he rested his troops and cared for the wounded. They were followed by Hannibal, who arrived only a few days later. He formed his troops for battle, but the Romans refused the challenge. This not only bolstered the morale of the Carthaginian troops, but also convinced some Gauls to switch sides. During the night, some 2,000 Gallic warriors abandoned the Roman camp and joined Hannibal's army. The nearby Boii and Insubres, now formally allied with the Carthaginians, and Gallic aid that Hannibal was counting on finally started pouring in. Seeing his position weakened, Scipio used the cover of night to retreat across the Trebia river. He fortified his position on a hilltop overlooking the river and there waited for reinforcements. When the news of Hannibal's arrival in Italy reached Rome, a great panic ensued. For all their pre-war preparations, no one expected that a large army could cross the Alps. Sempronius Longus, who was currently in Lilybaeum preparing his African campaign, was swiftly recalled and ordered to reinforce Scipio. Polybius informs us that the army reached Arminium in only 40 days. From there, they marched towards Scipio, who was still encamped near Trebia. Hannibal was in no rush to force an engagement with the Romans. Fresh Gallic troops were arriving each day, and he took his time to drill them into shape. The garrison commander of nearby Clastidium betrayed the Romans and joined up with Hannibal. Large grain stores in the city eased Punic supply problems. When Sempronius arrived at the scene, he was eager for a battle as soon as possible. He could see that Hannibal's army was growing by the day, and he wanted to stop that while the balance of power was still in his favor. His actions may have also been forced by the Roman consular year. If he waited out the winter, another set of consuls would be elected, and he would lose his opportunity for eternal glory. His colleague Scipio, who had previously been looking for a fight at the first possible opportunity, was now advising caution, but his words fell on deaf ears and Sempronius took control of the combined army. Hannibal was frequently sending out raiding parties to gather supplies. During one of these raids, Sempronius sent out his cavalry to attack the Carthaginians. Laden with plunder, the raiders couldn't offer any resistance and they were chased back to the camp. The Punic guards reacted quickly and joined the fight. Seeing this, the Romans too sent reinforcements. A small skirmish was about to turn into a full-scale battle as more and more troops arrived from both sides. Hannibal could see that this battle was putting his entire invasion in danger and decided to stop it. He joined his men in front of the camp and formed them into a solid line. The men were refrained from advancing and stood their ground near the palisades. Seeing this wall of Carthaginian troops forming up, the Romans pulled back and the skirmish was over. Hannibal, who is known for carefully planning his every engagement, realized he could do little to influence this battle if it got out of hand. Showing great restraint on his part, he prevented a possible disaster and a quick end to his campaign. On the other hand, Sempronius saw this skirmish as a Roman victory, only strengthening his desire to face Hannibal in a real battle. Hannibal spent a few days riding up and down the river, trying to find the best spot for an engagement. Seeing a good hiding spot, he sent his brother Mago with 1,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry to set an ambush during the night. In the early morning, he sent his Numidian cavalry to harass the Romans, hoping to draw Sempronius out. The consul took the bait and sent his entire cavalry in pursuit. The Numidians were careful to avoid a close engagement and retreated slowly across the river. Sempronius now fully committed and marched out with the rest of his army. The infantry slowly crossed the river and formed into the usual three lines on the west bank of the Trebia. The cavalry was recalled, joining the infantry on the wings. The Romans were roused from their sleep by the Numidians and had no time to eat.
The Trebia was flooding at the time, and the men got wet while crossing. This force was almost twice the size of a regular consular army, and it was mostly made up of fresh recruits. According to some accounts, it took them almost 5 hours to finally form up for battle. By that time, they were already hungry, cold, and exhausted, but there was no turning back now. Hannibal planned for all of this. His troops had enough time to do all the necessary preparations while the Romans were still crossing the river. He now marched out with the entire force. Compared to the 32,000 Roman infantry, Hannibal had only 20,000. He had to place all of his infantry into a single thin line. The Gauls were positioned in the center, with Spanish and Libyan troops on their sides. One advantage Hannibal did have was 10,000 cavalry, compared to only 4,000 Romans. They were placed on the wings along with the elephants. And thus, in December of 218 BCE, the first pitched battle of the war, the Battle of Trebia, started. Fighting was fierce from both sides. The Roman center came in strong, and the Carthaginians started giving ground. The outnumbered Roman cavalry could put up only feeble resistance, and they soon broke, fleeing back to the camp. The Punic cavalry now encircled the Romans. Sensing an opportunity, Mago sprang from his hiding spot and joined the cavalry. Although encircled, the Roman center continued pushing, and they broke the Gallic troops in the center. Some 10,000 legionaries marched through the Punic line. They had no intention of returning to the battle, and still in formation, they marched towards Placentia. The rest of the troops were not as lucky. While some managed to escape, most were cut down. The Battle of Trebia was the first of Hannibal's 3 great victories. The exact casualties are unknown, but it is estimated that the Romans lost somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men, while Hannibal lost only around 5,000. Most of the Punic losses were suffered by the easily replaceable Celtic allies. As the news of this battle spread, more and more Gauls joined Hannibal's cause. He could now see that his plan was working. Victories on the field could convince the Roman allies to switch sides and turn on their former masters. However, to persuade more communities to join his side, he would have to march down the Italian peninsula, deep into the Roman heartland. For the time being, Hannibal was stuck in Cisalpine Gaul. Winter was setting in, and he would have to wait it out in the north. An unusually cold spell hit his camp, and a great number of soldiers, along with all but one elephant, perished. The great victory ensured that none of his troops abandoned him during these harsh winter months. On the contrary, his army would double in size by the time he was ready to march again in the spring. In the aftermath of the battle, Sempronius tried to downplay this catastrophe, even blaming the bad weather for his defeat. But when the Senate learned the real extent of the disaster, they were thrown into a frenzy. Luckily, the consular elections gave them an opportunity for a fresh start. Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius were elected consuls of 217. Flaminius was a new man, or the first member of his family to be elected to the highest office. He was somewhat of a populist, passing a land reform law during his tenure as a tribune of the plebs. During his first consulship in 223 BCE, he led a successful campaign against the Insubres, who now made up a large part of Hannibal's army. Each consul was assigned a new army and sent north with orders to stop Hannibal's advance at all costs. As winter slowly gave way to spring, a new campaigning season was at hand, and Hannibal could finally continue his journey. He marched out of Cisalpine Gaul with more than 50,000 men, a far cry from the comparably modest army that crossed the Alps. Hannibal was now faced with yet another mountain range in his path. The Apennine Mountains run down the Italian peninsula, splitting it into western and eastern halves. There was only a few convenient crossing spots over the mountains, and Hannibal would have to commit to one side or the other. He could either go east and march down the Adriatic coast, or he could cross the Apennines in the north and march through Etruria. The Romans were well aware of this, and Servilius was stationed in Arminium to defend the eastern path, while Flaminius was covering the various passes across the mountains from Arretium. Flaminius was eager to begin operations, and he left Rome before officially taking auspices on the 15th of March. This was unconventional and seen as a bad omen. He was recalled to Rome to retake auspices, but he ignored the Senate. This blatant disrespect for the gods would not go unpunished. Hannibal chose a more difficult but more lucrative path. The rich lands of Etruria could easily sustain his large army. This path would also lead him directly to Rome. He crossed the mountains near the town of Porretta, reaching the marshy grounds around the river Arno. It took them 3 days to force their way through the marshes, suffering heavy losses in the process. Hannibal himself was one of the casualties, as he lost one of his eyes to an infection. He had to be carried out by the last surviving elephant, the brave Surus mentioned by Cato. After finally emerging from the marshes, Hannibal allowed his men several days of rest. During this time, he sent scouts in all directions and learned that Flaminius was encamped near Arretium. Instead of facing him immediately, Hannibal passed him by and led his troops into Etruria, where they could freely plunder the land. Even though he was outnumbered 2-1, Flaminius set off in pursuit, just as Hannibal had hoped. His senior officers advised him to wait for reinforcements from Servilius, but he had no intention of sharing glory with his colleague. The Carthaginian march away from the Roman army resembled a frightened enemy fleeing in haste, giving Romans false hopes of an easy victory. Polybius informs us that the army was swollen by volunteers from ravaged communities who hoped to sell defeated Carthaginians into slavery. Flaminius now picked up his pace and caught up to Hannibal near Lake Trasimene. A narrow path ran along the shore of the lake. It was bound by water on one side and steep wooded hills on the other. Riding along the coast, Hannibal saw an opportunity for setting up an ambush. He reached the other side of the lake and built a camp in a visible position. The Romans, who could clearly see the Carthaginians on the other side of the lake, encamped for the night, hoping to finally catch them the next day. As night fell, the Punic troops quietly abandoned the camp and hid among the trees on the hillside. The Spanish and Libyan troops were placed nearest to the camp. Next to them were the Gauls, and on the far side, closest to the Roman position, was the cavalry. On the misty morning of the 21st of June 217 BC, Flaminius set out with his troops along the shore of Lake Trasimene. The unsuspecting Romans marched right into the Punic trap. The Carthaginians showed great restraint and waited for Hannibal's signal to charge in. When the Roman vanguard finally reached the Spanish and Libyan troops at the far end of the path, the signal was given and all troops simultaneously charged down the mountains. There was no time for the Romans to form a battle line, and they had to defend individually or in small groups. Most of the men were confused, as mist prevented them from seeing the enemy, only hearing the sounds of battle all around them. The fighting was heaviest in the middle, where the Celts again suffered heavy casualties. Even in the face of certain death, the Roman troops stood their ground. Flaminius rode up and down the column, organizing his troops as best as he could. One of the Gauls recognized the consul and charged at him on his horse. He broke through the bodyguards and impaled Flaminius. The nearby troops pushed back the Gauls and saved his body, but the consul was already dead. Eventually, the Roman vanguard managed to break through the Punic blockade, and some 6,000 troops escaped the slaughter. When they realized no friendly troops were behind them, they could only look back in horror. As the mist slowly began to thin out, a great Roman calamity was plain to see. With the death of their consul, the Romans finally lost heart. All organized defense was broken. The men abandoned their weapons and started fleeing. Some jumped into the lake only to drown, while others were run down by the Punic cavalry. The vanguard, seeing no way of aiding their friends, retreated to a nearby village. Later in the day, they were surrounded by one of the Punic officers, Masherbal, and some Spanish troops. The 6,000 Romans surrendered under the condition they could go free, but Hannibal had no intention of honoring this deal. The Romans were enslaved, but as usual, the allied troops were well treated and eventually sent back home. Hannibal's stated goal was the liberation of Italians from Roman oppression. All captured allied troops during the campaign were treated in the same manner and released. Hannibal hoped that acting in this way would endear him to the Italians, who would eventually join his side when the time was right. The Battle of Lake Trasimene is one of the biggest ambushes in military history. Polybius tells us that 15,000 Romans were killed and most of the remaining 10,000 were captured. The Punic losses were a mere 1,500 and again mostly Gauls. This battle shows the true brilliance of Hannibal as a commander. His tactical knowledge was unparalleled and he could seemingly predict every move his opponents would make. The second of Hannibal's great victories would throw Rome into a panicked frenzy. An enemy general was freely marching across their homeland and easily dealing with everything thrown at him. It was now time for the Romans to change their approach. In the years following the battle, more and more blame was placed on Flaminius himself. Unlike some generals who presided over terrible defeats, Flaminius had no influential family members who could steer the narrative in his favor. Livy describes him as a rash and aggressive demagogue who used the poor masses to overcome all opposition in the Senate. He was said to be a man of bold words, but little talent to show for it. His unwillingness to respect tradition was often blamed for the disaster. In these situations, it's especially hard to separate fact from fiction. Up to this point, Flaminius had a relatively successful career, especially for a new man. Only a handful of men in Rome ever rose to the highest office, and even fewer of them held it multiple times. He also served as tribune of the plebs, praetor, and censor, achieving some success in all these roles. Contrary to Livy's claims, the Roman elections were heavily rigged in favor of the rich and powerful, and Flaminius must have had some support among the senators. However, following his defeat, all his friends quickly turned against him, and thus began the assassination of his character in ancient sources. When Servilius got word of Hannibal's movements, he set out immediately to aid Flaminius. He sent his entire cavalry, some 4,000 horsemen, ahead of the rest of the army. The Punic scouts saw them well in advance, and Mascarbal set a trap. He was successful, killing or capturing most of them. The consular army was now left without cavalry support, and they posed no significant threat to the Carthaginians. In the days following the battle, the rumors of a great defeat started spreading through the city, as more and more survivors slowly returned to Rome. A praetor, Marcus Pomponius, addressed the populace in the forum by simply proclaiming, "We were defeated in a great battle." The people were thrown into a panic. Losing an army was always disastrous, but losing two in such a short period of time was catastrophic. For the first time in centuries, the safety of the Eternal City was called into question. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and Quintus Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator. In sharp contrast to Flaminius, Quintus was a member of one of the most influential families in Rome, the Fabii. His grandfather, the famous Fabius Maximus Rullianus, was a hero of the Samnite Wars. He was 5-time consul and once a dictator, an incredible feat his grandson would eventually surpass. Fabius had already served as consul twice, and he was seen as a steady hand who could guide Rome to victory. Marcus Minucius Rufus was chosen as the master of the horse, and the two men did their best to prepare the defenses of the city. Utmost care was taken to properly respect all religious obligations. They even consulted the Sibylline books, the ancient books of prophecies that date all the way back to the monarchy. This flurry of activity finally put the people of Rome at ease. Hannibal had no intentions of marching on Rome, and he crossed the Apennines. Along the way, his troops continued ravaging the countryside, gathering even more supplies. After finally reaching the Adriatic coast, Hannibal gave his troops ample time to rest and treat their wounds. They would periodically move their camp along the coast in order to gain access to new raiding opportunities. For the first time since leaving Spain, Hannibal was able to send a message to Carthage. The news of his victories caused great elation in the city. He was promised support from his countrymen, but little of it would ever reach him. Back in Rome, Fabius raised a new army and marched towards Servilius. The consul was sent to Ostia to take control of the new fleet gathering there, while the dictator combined the two armies and set off in pursuit of Hannibal, who was still moving south. Fabius and his 40,000 troops caught up to him near Aechae in Apulia. In contrast to other Roman generals of the time, Fabius was cautious in his approach, and he extensively scouted the area. Upon meeting him, Hannibal immediately tried to offer battle, but there was no answer from the dictator. It quickly became clear that Fabius had no intention of putting his army in danger. His fresh recruits had little hope against the battle-hardened Carthaginians. Instead, he followed Hannibal for months, always holding the high ground. Although avoiding a pitched battle, the Romans frequently harassed the Punic foragers, putting strain on their supply lines. With each consecutive victory, Fabius was slowly rebuilding the confidence of his men. The villagers were advised to abandon their farms and take refuge in the nearby forts. The Carthaginians would lose too much trying to besiege one of these forts, and they would usually just move on to the next area. Hannibal now descended from the Samnite mountains to the fertile lands of Campania. He started plundering the richest fields in the whole of Italy, the Ager Falernus, hoping this would finally provoke the Romans into attacking him, or convince Capua and the Greek cities to switch sides. But the Campanians stayed loyal to Rome, just as they did some 60 years ago when another great general, Pyrrhus of Epirus, tried to sway them to his side. As always, Fabius looked from the safety of the mountains, refusing to take the bait. Instead, he positioned his troops along the narrow passes leading away from the valley, effectively entrapping Hannibal. His patience and hard work paid off, and the Romans finally got the upper hand. Hannibal, realizing he had no easy way out of the valley, had to get creative. He gathered up all the oxen and strapped torches to their horns. In the night, the Carthaginians lit the torches and drove the cattle up the ridge. Seeing this mass of lights, some 4,000 Roman troops holding the pass believed Hannibal was trying to escape, and they descended upon him. After getting close, the men realized they had been tricked, but they were suddenly attacked by the Punic skirmishers. Seeing this commotion, higher officers, and especially Minucius, pressured Fabius to attack, but he refused to budge. He, perhaps rightly, believed that his inexperienced troops would find it too difficult to fight in the dead of night. Meanwhile, Hannibal and his army were ascending the pass in complete darkness, unseen by the Romans. As the sun came up, Hannibal's success was plain to see. Caught in a desperate position, he used his cunning to evade the Romans and escape into Samnium. Fabius was left humiliated, and he could only return to following Hannibal around. From the very beginning, his strategy was seen as cowardly, and he was despised by the highly militaristic society of Rome. This blunder only strengthened the view that Fabius was inept for leadership in such difficult times. Calls for his removal could be heard in the city, a highly unusual occurrence for a serving dictator. When he returned to Rome to attend some religious duties, he left Minucius in charge, with strict orders to avoid contact with the enemy. Minucius was one of the biggest critics of the dictator, and he sought an engagement at the first possible opportunity. Attacking the unorganized Carthaginian foragers, he won a large skirmish. The news of this victory spread like wildfire, soon reaching Rome. In an unprecedented move, the tribune of the plebs Metellus granted the imperium to Minucius. This meant that the two men had equal power. The army was split in half, and each of them took control of a standard consular army. Predictably, Hannibal lured Minucius into a trap. During the night, he concealed some 5,000 of his best soldiers in the surrounding area. The next morning, he deployed some of his men on the hill overlooking the Roman camp. Minucius was keen on driving them off, but Hannibal sent more and more reinforcements. Eventually, Minucius sent out his entire army towards the Carthaginians. The Romans were fighting uphill, and they slowly started giving ground. At that moment, the concealed Carthaginians sprang from the woods, encircling Minucius. Hannibal had done it again. Another Roman army was caught in a desperate situation and would have been utterly defeated were it not for Fabius. He sallied forth from his camp, arriving in a nick of time to push back the Carthaginians. Hannibal, choosing to spare his already exhausted soldiers, retreated back to the nearby town of Geronium, where he would spend the winter months. Realizing he was no match for the two great generals, Minucius relinquished his imperium, returning full command to the dictator. On a personal level, he hailed Fabius as a father, a powerful gesture in ancient Rome. The rest of the year passed in a relative calm as both sides prepared for winter. In December of 217, a 6-month term expired and Fabius returned to Rome, leaving the army in the hands of the consuls. The style of warfare used by Fabius would eventually bear his name. Today it's known as the Fabian strategy, and it was often employed when a smaller army had to face a far superior invader. Avoiding battle at all costs gave Rome enough time to recover from the previous defeats. Although mocked at the time, even the proud Romans eventually realized that Fabius alone assured their survival. For his actions, he was given the nickname Cunctator, meaning the delayer. As the new consular elections were approaching, a powerful faction in the city called for a more decisive leader who would bring them to victory. They would soon get their way. It seems that the only general in Italy who could fully appreciate the brilliance of Fabius's plan was Hannibal himself. His position was significantly weakened without losing a single battle. Not a single Italian city defected to his side, ruining his main plan. His Gallic troops were getting anxious due to this aimless wandering. We even hear rumors of Spanish troops planning a mutiny. Another winless year, and Hannibal would find himself in a desperate position. The Romans would make sure that doesn't happen. In 216 BC, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus were elected consuls on a platform of finally destroying Hannibal's army. These two men would preside over the greatest defeat in Roman history. Varro was a new man, and he would suffer the same fate as Flaminius. He is described as a demagogue with radical views. He is even said to be the son of a butcher, but this claim is dubious at best. Even though he survived the following battle, he is remembered as the chief architect of the disaster. On the other hand, Paulus had powerful descendants who could steer the narrative in his favor. He is described as a calm and careful leader who advocated for the continuation of the Fabian strategy. We should note that his grandson, Scipio Aemilianus, was the patron of our primary source, Polybius. We should thus be careful when examining his writings as well as the work of later authors, who undoubtedly had access to his histories. Why would the Romans, who were starved for a battle, elect someone who was advising against it? In a desperate move, the Romans raised 8 legions. In addition, each legion was expanded from 3,000 to 5,000 men. The legions were supported by an additional 8 alii of the same size, meaning that the Romans mustered an unprecedented army of 80,000 men. The infantry was supported by a further 6,000 cavalry. Each consul was given the equivalent of 2 entire consular armies,
and rather than splitting their forces, the two of them marched out together. Additionally, another army, 25,000 strong, was assigned to Lucius Postumius Albinus. He was given orders to march north and invade Hannibal's allies in Cisalpine Gaul. The people of Rome, and especially the soldiers, were in high spirits. Even though they had suffered two great defeats recently, the Romans still believed in their innate supremacy over the Carthaginians. The allies were as eager to fight as the Romans themselves. Their communities had been ravaged the previous year, and they were keen on revenge. A large number of senators accompanied the army, either as military tribunes, in the cavalry, or as advisors to the consuls. And thus one of the largest armies in Roman history marched towards Hannibal's winter quarters in Geronium. As the crops started to ripen in late spring, Hannibal finally moved out. He received news of a large Roman supply depot in the ruined fortress of Cannae. By the time Hannibal captured the fort, the combined Roman army was fast approaching. Learning quickly from their past mistakes, the Romans moved along the shore, giving Hannibal no opportunity to set an ambush. We are told that Paulus didn't want to battle on the open ground around Cannae. He believed it would benefit Hannibal's numerically superior cavalry, but he recognized that the armies were too close together for a safe retreat. Furthermore, retreating now would be a huge hit to Roman morale. With no other choice, the army slowly advanced, moving their camp a little closer each day. The Romans were now in position, with their camp on the north side of the river. Paulus sent a part of the army to set up a smaller camp on the south side, with orders to protect the foraging parties. Hannibal, who was encamped near Cannae on the south side, now crossed the river and moved his camp opposite the Romans. Feeding a large army was always difficult, but in this situation both sides found it almost impossible. The sheer size of the Roman army presented a problem of its own. They were used to feeding armies less than a quarter the size. On the other side, the Carthaginians would soon deplete all supplies from Cannae, and lacking any allies in the area, they would find themselves in a difficult situation. The size of the Roman army intimidated the Carthaginians. According to some accounts, even Hannibal himself contemplated abandoning the army and escaping to Cisalpine Gaul. During one meeting, one of the officers, Gisco, commented on their numerical advantage. The solemn general replied, "There are a lot of Romans over there, but there is not one called Gisco," prompting a burst of laughter from the gathered officers. Although Hannibal lightened the mood a little, the seriousness of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The mood was quite different in the Roman camp. After years of defeats, they were finally staring into the eyes of a great victory. When the two Roman consuls combined their armies, they would take hold of command on alternate days. This meant that the consul in charge could choose to fight or to stay back in the camp. The days before the battle were filled with frequent skirmishes, with neither side gaining a significant advantage. On the 1st of August, Hannibal led out his troops, but Paulus, who was in command on that day, refused the challenge. The following day, Varro took the initiative and marched the legions to the south side of the river. The army was so large that there was not enough space to deploy them in the usual manner. The 55,000 heavy infantry were packed more densely than usual. The gaps between the maniples were smaller, and each maniple was deeper than it was customary. They were still formed in the usual three lines, with 15,000 light velites in front. This dense formation made the inexperienced army easier to control. 2,400 Roman cavalry were placed on the right wing, while the remaining 3,600 allied horse covered the left wing. In both previous defeats, the Carthaginian center collapsed under the weight of the legions. The Romans must have realized this was their best bet for defeating Hannibal. For this plan to work, the cavalry would have to play a crucial role. Although outnumbered, they would have to hold the Punic counterparts long enough for the center to break through. For this reason, each of the consuls took command of one part of the cavalry. Paulus rode with the Romans on the right, while Varro was with the allies on the left. The former consul, Servilius, was put in charge of the center. The Romans were so confident in their victory that 10,000 men were left behind to defend the camp, with orders to attack the Punic base once the battle started. Seeing the Romans cross the river, Hannibal sent out his entire force. From his positioning, it seems that he had perfectly predicted the Roman plan. 20,000 Celts and 4,000 Spanish troops were mixed together and formed the center. They were all placed into a single line, roughly the size of the Roman center. The 10,000 Libyan troops, wearing Roman equipment gathered at Trasimene, were split into two and placed on the wings. They were formed into deep narrow columns and hidden behind the line. Roughly 8,000 skirmishers were positioned in front of the first line. The 4,000 light Numidian cavalry were placed on the right flank, while the remaining 6,000 heavy cavalry were placed on the left. The most important action would be fought in the center,
and Hannibal with his brother Mago took position behind the Spanish and Celtic troops. One of the officers, Hasdrubal, took control of the heavy cavalry, while Hanno commanded the Numidians. Both sides were now finally ready for the battle to commence. To reiterate, the Romans had 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. On the other side, the Carthaginians had 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. From the outset, Hannibal's victory was not at all assured. His plan was extremely risky, as the Punic infantry was outnumbered almost 2 to 1. If the Libyan troops failed to stop the Roman advance, no amount of cavalry could turn the tides. And thus, on the 2nd of August 216 BC, one of the most famous battles of antiquity started. Hannibal sent the center of his Spanish and Celtic troops forward, forming a crescent shape towards the Romans. On the Roman right, Paulus and the Roman cavalry charged at their Punic counterparts. Heavily outnumbered, the Romans were quickly broken, falling into a complete rout. Rather than abandoning the battlefield, Paulus dismounted and joined the Roman center. The legions now finally reached the bulging Punic line, and a fierce action was fought in the middle. The Romans came on strong, but the Spanish and Celtic troops held their ground. The Celts were known to be forceful initially, but quickly tire out and retreat. At Cannae, they offered fierce resistance for a prolonged period of time. The presence of Spanish troops among their ranks gave them stability. Eventually, the sheer number of Romans pressing forth finally prevailed. The Punic line started giving ground, no more than a step at a time. The front line was now flattened, yet the Romans continued to push forward. With each step, the Romans gained momentum, and eventually the Carthaginians were formed in a reverse crescent. Seeing their enemy give way, Paulus and nearby tribunes ordered more and more troops forward. Any semblance of the three-line formation was lost, and the Romans collapsed into a heap of men pushing forward. Finally, after enduring as long as they could, the Punic center crumbled, and the Spaniards and Celts started fleeing. The Roman forces were elated. Victory was within their grasp. In this moment, Hannibal gave a signal to the Libyans, and they fell on the Romans with all their might. For all this time, the Libyan troops had been resting while their enemy fought a grueling battle. Their Roman equipment further confused the exhausted legionaries. The Roman advance was stopped in its tracks, and victory was snatched right from their hands. While the infantry was advancing, the Numidians harassed the allied cavalry, refusing to fully engage. On the left, Hasdrubal was done chasing the Romans, and he gathered up all the heavy cavalry. They then wheeled around and charged towards Vero. Seeing the enemy fast approaching, the Roman cavalry broke and fled, leaving the infantry to fend for themselves. The Numidians chased after Vero, but Hasdrubal once more rallied his men and charged the Roman rear. Hannibal had done the impossible. He encircled the larger Roman army with his significantly smaller force. Although the Romans still outnumbered their enemy, they couldn't offer any significant resistance. What followed was a prolonged slaughter. For hours, the Carthaginians hacked away at the ever-shrinking circle of Romans. By nightfall, 50,000 men were lying dead on the field. At Cannae, the Carthaginian casualties were high, but for the Romans they were downright catastrophic. Hannibal lost 4,000 Gauls, 1,500 Spaniards and Libyans, and 200 cavalry. This amounts to more than 1/10 of his troops, an exceedingly high percentage for a victorious army in ancient times. Most of the losses were suffered once the center broke, but also while hacking at the stubborn Romans after they were encircled. On the other side, Polybius claims 70,000 Romans perished, with a further 10,000 captured. The more conservative Livy claims 48,000 dead and 21,000 captured, including those left behind at the camp. Whatever the case, these numbers are disastrous. Among the dead were 1 consul, 2 proconsuls, 2 quaestors, 29 military tribunes, and an additional 80 senators. A staggering 1/3 of the Senate was annihilated within a single afternoon. For all its size, the Battle of Cannae is completely absent from the archaeological record. The weapons and armor were extremely valuable in ancient times. In the days following any battle, the dead would be stripped of their valuables, and few weapons were ever left on the ground. The lack of other smaller artifacts or bones is harder to explain. The fields around Cannae have been cultivated by Italian farmers for more than 2 millennia after the battle. Over that long period, any items left in the ground were probably destroyed by plows and draft animals. Another factor to consider is the ever-changing course of the nearby river. The exact location of the river in the 3rd century BC is unknown. It is entirely possible that archaeologists simply haven't looked at the right place yet. We have to take all of this into account to explain the complete lack of any archaeological evidence of one of the largest battles fought on Italian soil. Here we come to one of the greatest unanswered questions in history. What if Hannibal had marched on Rome immediately after Cannae? The Romans believed that the delays Hannibal made after the battle were the sole reason for the city's survival. Some modern authors tend to agree, while others are more skeptical about this claim. Although the entire Roman army was just annihilated, they could still gather enough troops to man the walls. Hannibal couldn't take Rome by storm and would have to settle in for a lengthy siege. Even though the Carthaginian fleet had recently sailed along the west coast of Italy, in the event of a siege, the entire Roman navy would rush to aid the city. Hannibal had no hopes of taking Rome without naval support, and he knew this. His only bet would be to force the Romans to surrender. But as we have already seen throughout this entire series, the Romans were nothing if not stubborn. In the previous 2 years, the Romans and their allies lost upwards of 100,000 men. The male population of the city was decimated, and the leadership was left in shambles. In the face of all of this, the Romans chose to press on. As we shall soon see, they had no intention of negotiating with Hannibal, and any hopes of a surrender were misplaced. It is possible, as some authors claim, that the sight of the victorious army at their gates was just the push the Romans needed to consider peace negotiations, but this we can never truly know. On the day following the battle, Hannibal captured the Roman camps. The soldiers, still contemplating the scale of the disaster, offered no resistance. The remnants of the Roman army that managed to escape the slaughter started gathering in nearby towns. Varro, with only 70 horsemen, arrived at Venusia. A larger group, numbering several thousand, fled to nearby Canusium. Among these men were the young Publius Scipio and the son of Fabius Maximus. Eventually, as many as 10,000 men gathered there before Varro arrived to take command. These survivors would soon be formed into 2 legions and sent into Sicily. They were forbidden from disbanding or returning to Italy for the duration of the war. Hannibal gathered all Roman prisoners, some 8,000 of them, and chose a delegation of 10 men among them. They were sent to Rome to negotiate the ransom. Punic officer Carthalo was sent with them, presumably to negotiate the surrender of Rome. Arriving near the city, Carthalo received a message from the Senate, forbidding him from even entering Rome. This was a shock to the Carthaginians. By all conventions of the ancient world, the Romans lost the war, and there was no more point in needlessly losing men. Any civilized community, from the shores of the Atlantic to the far-flung reaches of India, would have surrendered by now. But just as Pyrrhus had learned years ago, the Romans had no such civilities. They refused to negotiate with any enemy still on their soil. As for the prisoners, the Senate had no intention of getting them back. A vote was passed to refuse the ransom, and the private citizens were forbidden from dealing with the Carthaginians. Some of the 8,000 men were executed, while others were sold into slavery. As the news of this great defeat slowly spread across Italy, some communities finally saw a chance to break away from Rome. Soon much of southern Italy would rise in open revolt. Slowly, the Romans started recovering from the shock of this disaster and took practical measures to defend the city. The minimum property requirements for serving in the military were lowered to allow poorer citizens to serve. Many 17-year-olds were also enlisted. Soon, at least 4 legions were gathered in Rome. Household slaves were promised freedom in return for their service. As many as 8,000 volunteered for the military. Another 6,000 men were gathered from among criminals and debtors. They were promised amnesty in return for their service. Remnants of the high command, including Varro, were recalled to the city. Varro was commended by the Senate for his actions after the battle, namely regrouping the survivors and refusing to deal with Hannibal. He would go on to hold military command for the rest of his career, but he would never again lead a Roman army in battle. Times again called for a dictator, and Marcus Junius Pera was elected, with Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus as his master of horse. By the end of 216, Pera was able to lead an army of 25,000 strong out of the city. A far cry from the massive force gathered at the start of the year, but a capable fighting force nonetheless. Previous commanders, namely Gaius Flaminius, the architect of the disaster at Trasimene, neglected their religious duties. The Senate now took great care to honor all the necessary traditions. 2 Vestal virgins were buried alive for breaking their vow of chastity. The Sibylline books, the ancient books of prophecy dating back to the monarchy, were consulted. As a result, a rare instance of human sacrifice was performed in Rome. A pair of Greeks and Gauls were buried alive in the city. Fabius Pictor was sent to Delphi to consult the famous oracle of Apollo. Numerous offerings were presented to the gods, and all sorts of omens were carefully observed. When Pera left the city for military business in Campania, Varro appointed another man, Marcus Fabius Buteo, as a co-dictator.
This was highly unusual, as this is the only instance of two dictators serving at the same time in Roman history. Buteo was the oldest ex-censor still alive, and he was chosen to fill vacancies in the Senate left by the disaster at Cannae. Buteo was uncomfortable with this appointment, and he resigned as soon as his task was completed. On the other hand, Hannibal had finally achieved his primary goal. After the extent of the disaster at Cannae circulated among the Italians, a large number of communities flocked to his side. Nearly all of Samnium and Bruttium, large parts of Apulia, and shockingly, the formerly loyal Greeks of Campania all betrayed Rome. Capua was at that point one of the greatest cities in Italy, second only to Rome itself. The Capuans had Roman citizenship, but without the right to vote or hold magistracies. Hannibal guaranteed their freedom from Carthage, and the Capuans hoped to become the masters of Italy once Rome was defeated. The loss of this crucial ally was a hard blow to the Romans. The Gauls in the north were still in open revolt. Following Hiero's death in 215, Syracuse joined the Carthaginian cause, followed by Philip V of Macedon a year later. The situation looked bleak for Rome, and it seemed only a matter of time before they would succumb to these mounting pressures. With Cannae, Polybius ends his continuous narrative. His later books, describing the later years of the war, are lost to history. We must now turn to Livy, who discusses these years in great detail. Unfortunately, his account is often unreliable. Many of the great battles he describes seem to be no more than small skirmishes. It's possible that his sources were tainted by exaggerations made by senatorial families, hoping to insert themselves into the narrative. Following the three great battles in Italy, the war devolved into fighting for control of key strategic points, with the Romans avoiding pitched battles at all costs. The strategies developed by the delayer were now wholeheartedly accepted among the upper command. It is therefore harder to construct a detailed narrative of the war, and we can only follow the major events. The war was now spreading out of Italy, but we will first examine Hannibal's movements on the peninsula and later tackle the Spanish, Sicilian, and Greek theaters. Hannibal arrived in Campania late in 216 BC. Although Capua did join his side, others were less eager to betray Rome. He attempted to storm Naples and Nola, but he was unsuccessful. Both cities stayed loyal to Rome, and Hannibal refused to commit large forces to the assault. He retreated to his winter quarters in Capua. While waiting for the next campaigning season, he besieged the nearby Casilinum, an important fortress on the river Volturnus, commanding the northern passes along the Via Appia and the Via Latina. Although a Roman army under Gracchus tried to resupply them, they ran out of food and surrendered to Hannibal. The city was given to Capua for defense, and Hannibal marched out of the area. In 215, Romans selected the former master of horse, Sempronius Gracchus, and Lucius Postumius Albinus as consuls. Postumius was elected in absentia, having been sent to Cisalpine Gaul to deal with the rebelling boy. However, before he could take office, he was ambushed and his army was annihilated. Postumius was beheaded, and his skull was gilded and used as a cup in ritual ceremonies for years to come. Out of the 20,000 men, only a few reached Rome to bring the news of yet another disaster. Fabius Maximus was elected in his place. In times of crisis, the Romans abandoned the mandatory 10-year gap between consulships. This was no exception, and several men would go on to serve multiple times in quick succession, including Fabius Maximus, Sempronius Gracchus, and two more notable generals of the time, Marcus Claudius Marcellus and Quintus Fulvius Flaccus. Additionally, they would all continue leading their armies after their term in office expired as pro-magistrates. This gave the Roman command some much-needed continuity. All these men were of an older generation, in their 50s and 60s. The heavy losses suffered by the senatorial class was hard to replace. Many experienced men in their prime were slain on the fields of Cannae, and most of the potential consuls of that generation were wiped out. The Romans had no other choice but to turn to the generals of the previous generation, battle-hardened on the rugged terrain of Sicily. The Romans raised 14 legions that year, most of whom were scattered across Italy within city garrisons and smaller raiding parties. As previously noted, they avoided gathering a large army in one place. Part of this force was deployed in Spain, Sicily, and to a lesser extent Macedonia. In these places far away from Hannibal, the Romans had more confidence in fighting pitched battles, and the men were more concentrated. By 211 BC, the Romans would field as many as 25 legions, or upwards of 100,000 men, along with a similar number of allied troops.
The main problem Hannibal now faced was defending his new allies. Although many communities joined his side, his armies didn't see a noticeable increase. The Italians were afraid of Roman reprisal and were unwilling to commit a large number of troops to the cause. This meant that Hannibal's once strong army was frequently needed to repel the Romans. But as soon as Hannibal closed in, the Romans scattered and some other city fell under siege. Hannibal's allies were unhappy with the speed of his responses, while he rushed across southern Italy to put out fires on all sides. For the first few years after Cannae, the Romans focused their efforts mainly on Campania. In 215, Fabius and Gracchus marched into the area, but without any success. The following year, Fabius, covered by Marcellus, successfully recaptured Casilinum, opening the way to Capua. During this time, Hannibal repeatedly tried to take Nola, but he was repelled each time. Gradually, Hannibal was losing his hold over Campania. Back in 216, after the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal sent his brother Mago to Carthage to bring news and request aid. Mago presented countless gold rings of Roman equestrians as proof of the great success on the plains of Cannae. He requested provisions and reinforcements from the Senate. An old enemy of their father and the leader of the anti-war faction, Hanno the Great, argued against sending aid to Italy. However, the pro-Barca faction still held sway in the Senate, and they agreed to dispatch 4,000 Numidian cavalry and 40 war elephants. Mago was also instructed to raise an additional 20,000 troops. While gathering this army, the Carthaginians got the news of a heavy defeat suffered by Hasdrubal in Iberia. Instead of aiding Hannibal, Mago and his army were redirected to Spain, while the Numidians and the elephants, along with some provisions and silver, were sent to Italy. This would be the only assistance Hannibal received from his state during all his long years of campaigning in Italy. Following the third failed attempt to capture Nola in 214, Hannibal received a delegation from Tarentum. They claimed that the city would defect to his side once his army approached the walls. Eager to secure a large port in Italy, Hannibal marched south immediately, but once he approached the city, no help came from within and he had to retreat. 2 years later, in 212, he would get another opportunity when a group of young aristocrats offered him the city. They were promised the same terms as Capua. Tarentum was guaranteed freedom from Carthage, while Hannibal would take the Roman garrison as captives. Hannibal picked a body of 10,000 men and marched them towards the city under the cover of darkness. The conspirators opened the gates and admitted the army into the city. While most of the defenders on the walls were easily dealt with, the bulk of the Roman garrison remained safe within the citadel. Hannibal tried to take it by direct assault, but he failed. Content with the men trapped inside the city, he left the Tarentines in charge of the blockade. The loss of Tarentum, yet another strong city in the south, was a heavy blow to the Romans. Nonetheless, they remained unshaken and chose to mount a full-scale assault on Capua. Since 215, the Romans had been sending raiding parties to burn crops before the harvesting seasons, putting a strain on the Greek supplies. Now, in 212, both consuls, Quintus Fulvius Flaccus and Appius Claudius Pulcher, marched into Campania and set up a blockade of the city. In response, Hannibal only sent 2,000 cavalry with promises of further help in the future. The Capuan cavalry was always a capable fighting force. With the help of the Numidian detachments, they won several small skirmishes on the flat plains of Campania. However, these small victories were not enough to prevent a Roman blockade, and Hannibal had no choice but to march to Capua. He offered battle immediately upon his arrival, but the fighting was indecisive. The Roman consuls marched off in the opposite directions, forcing Hannibal to go after only one of them. After calling off the pursuit, Hannibal stumbled upon a Roman army commanded by a centurion, Marcus Centenius. The army was completely destroyed, and Centenius died fighting. Abandoning Capua to its fate, Hannibal marched to Apulia in search of another Roman army. Soon enough, both consuls returned to Capua and continued the siege. They amassed large amounts of supplies in Casilinum and established strongholds along the river Volturnus. This allowed them to easily resupply the armies along the river. The two consuls were joined by a praetor, Claudius Nero, and his 2 legions. The combined armies, or around 60,000 men, began constructing a wall around Capua, hoping to completely encircle the city. Before the wall was finished, the Capuans sent a final plea to Hannibal, but he had other matters to attend to. The brother of the consul Flaccus was carelessly leading an army in Apulia. Hannibal got word of his movements and set up a trap near Herdonia. Similar to the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal concealed a force of 3,000 light infantry in the nearby forest. Once the battle began, the concealed troops sprang from the trap and the Roman army was encircled. Seeing their approach, Flaccus fled from the field and his army was destroyed. An estimated 16,000 Romans perished. The survivors were sent to Sicily to join the survivors from Cannae, still serving on the island. Following this victory, Hannibal marched off to Brundisium, hoping to capture it by treachery. Before the walls around Capua were closed, any citizen who surrendered voluntarily was promised a pardon. None responded, and the walls closed around them. In 211, the three generals stayed in command, and the capture of Capua remained a top priority for the Romans. The Capuan cavalry still posed a significant problem for the Roman armies until a centurion, Quintus Naevius, came up with an ingenious solution. A line of velites would march behind the cavalry, creating a moving wall. The retreating Roman horse could fall back behind the velites and regroup for another charge. This finally gave the Romans an advantage. Hannibal was now the only hope for Capua, and he once again rushed to Campania to aid the city. He still held the advantage on open ground, but the Romans refused to leave their fortifications. A desperate charge onto the fortifications was unsuccessful, and Hannibal tried a different approach. He marched his forces to the gates of Rome, hoping to lure the legions away from Capua. However, while his army was formidable on open terrain, it didn't pose a threat to the strong walls of Rome. Lacking supplies, he was soon forced to lift the siege. Unable to further assist Capua, he marched off to southern Italy. Seeing their last hopes dwindle, the Capuans had no choice but to surrender and open the gates. 53 Capuan senators were held responsible for the rebellion and executed on the orders of Fulvius Flaccus. The Roman Senate dissolved Capua as a city-state and appointed a Roman governor. Hannibal's strongest ally in Italy was now defeated, and his foothold in Campania was gone. Capua would never recover from this defeat, and Neapolis, later named Naples, would rise to the position of chief city in Campania. As we have already stated, the Roman ability to press from all sides simultaneously could not be matched by Hannibal. Avoiding pitched battles at all costs ensured that Roman losses stayed at a minimum. Few victories Hannibal did get were small in scale and ultimately inconsequential. His Italian allies were quickly realizing that they had little hope of aid from the Punic force. Additionally, those who surrendered voluntarily were treated favorably by the Romans. Without losing a single battle, Hannibal's allies were slowly defecting and his hold over Italy was shrinking. We should leave Hannibal for now and turn to Syracuse and the Sicilian theater. During Cairo's life, Syracuse enjoyed a long 50-year period of stability. Throughout that time, he remained loyal to Rome, enjoying a privileged position in the alliance. However, following his death in 215 BCE, the city devolved into infighting, all too common in the Greek city-states of the era. He was succeeded by his young grandson Hieronymus, who was quickly deposed. The elite established a shaky democracy in the city. Two Syracusan brothers who had previously served under Hannibal, Hippocrates and Epicides, first took control of the army and then the city in 214. They allied with their former general Hannibal, making confrontation with Rome inevitable. Following his successful defense of Nola, Marcellus was sent to Sicily during his consulship in 214. He stayed in command of the army the following year, choosing to launch a direct assault on Syracuse. We are told that the famous mathematician Archimedes constructed ingenious war machines capable of easily repelling the Roman advance. Assaulting a city as strongly fortified as Syracuse was always a challenge, and after suffering heavy losses, Marcellus backed down. He blockaded the city instead and settled in for a lengthy siege. The Carthaginians sent aid to their new allies, and a large army, numbering 25,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 12 war elephants landed in Heraclea Minoa. This army was led by the Punic general Himilco. He marched east along the coast and captured Agrigentum. Several Sicilian towns, seeing better prospects on the Carthaginian side, betrayed Rome and joined Himilco. Hoping to stop further defections, the Romans massacred the population of Anna. This brutal act backfired, and even more cities joined the Carthaginian side. Hippocrates led a large army out of Syracuse, hoping to merge forces with Himilco, but he was spotted by Marcellus. Most of his 10,000 infantry were killed or captured, while he managed to escape with 500 cavalry. Although this sizable Carthaginian army now moved close to Syracuse, they didn't chase off the Romans, who maintained their siege of the city. Instead of attacking the Roman position, the Carthaginians marched towards other towns in hopes of persuading them to join their side. Marcellus had no hopes of taking Syracuse by direct assault, and the siege was unlikely to break the city while it was being resupplied from the sea. This left him with few viable options. During a festival to the goddess Artemis in 212, Epicides distributed large amounts of wine to his citizens as compensation for the lack of food. Marcellus took this opportunity and sent a small party to scale the city walls. They successfully opened the gates from the inside, letting the bulk of the Roman army into the city. Syracuse was a large city with several walled-off sections. The Romans successfully captured the outer part, but the citadel and the docks remained in Greek hands. Himilco now rushed back to Syracuse to threaten the Roman army, but a disease outbreak struck his camp. Both Himilco and Hippocrates died from the disease, along with the bulk of the army. The remnants were in no condition to fight and had to fall back. Syracuse was once again dependent on shipments of food from Carthage. In late 212, Bomilcar led a massive merchant convoy supported by 150 warships to the city. Seeing a Roman fleet gathered in front of the harbor spooked Bomilcar, and he instead sailed to the recently captured Tarentum. The number of Roman ships assembled by Marcellus is unknown, but it is believed that his fleet was noticeably smaller. The last hope for Syracuse was now gone, and Epicides fled to Agrigentum. The citadel was betrayed by a Spanish officer who opened the gates, and the city finally fell. While plundering, the Roman soldiers had orders to take Archimedes alive, but he refused to move while working on a math problem. This angered the Roman soldier, who then killed the great Polymath. According to legend, Archimedes' last words were, "Do not disturb my circles." The Carthaginian foothold on Sicily was now concentrated around Agrigentum, with another Carthaginian, Hanno, and Epicides in command. Hannibal sent some reinforcements from Italy, including a commander of Numidian cavalry, Mutinus. Mutinus was a capable general, and he won several large skirmishes against Marcellus. He also led successful raids against numerous villages in the area. Seeing his successes, many communities switched to the Carthaginian side. But while he was winning over the soldiers and the Sicilian population, Mutinus was garnering envy from the Punic commanders. In late 211 BCE, Marcellus returned to Rome to hold a consulship the following year. Due to his harsh treatment of Syracuse, he was assigned to the Italian campaign, while his colleague Marcus Valerius Laevinus was sent into Sicily. The Carthaginians sent a new force of 8,000 infantry and 3,000 Numidian cavalry to reinforce Agrigentum. Nonetheless, Laevinus chose to directly attack the city. Prior to his arrival at Agrigentum, the envious Carthaginian generals removed Mutinus from the head of the Numidians. However, the men remained loyal to him, and upon the approach of the Romans, Mutinus opened the gates and let them into the city. The last Carthaginian stronghold on Sicily was taken with ease. In the aftermath, 40 cities surrendered voluntarily, 20 were betrayed to the Romans, and only 6 had to be taken by assault. The battle for Sicily ended in a complete Roman victory. Mutinus was rewarded with Roman citizenship and appointed commander of the auxiliary forces. The Spanish general and his men who betrayed Syracuse were also granted citizenship and new lands in Sicily. The leaders of cities that voluntarily surrendered were also rewarded, while those who resisted were punished harshly. The resources, and especially the grain, coming in from Sicily would aid the Roman recovery in the later years of the Second Punic War. The Sicilian campaign illustrates the incompetence of Punic commanders. Aside from Hannibal and his officers, the Carthaginians could rarely beat the Roman forces on the field. The inaction of Himilco and Bomilcar doomed Syracuse, while the infighting among the generals in Agrigentum cost Carthage its last foothold on Sicily. We should now look to the east and the actions of the Macedonian king. Stirred up by Demetrius of Paphos, an Illyrian general and an old enemy of Rome, young King Philip V was growing wary of the Roman presence in Illyria. Emboldened by the disaster at Cannae, Philip joined into an alliance with Hannibal, sparking the First Macedonian War. At that time, Macedonia was not much larger than it had been before Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great. The Macedonians were embroiled in a war with the Aetolian League, an alliance of Greek city-states. Demetrius, seeking an opportunity to regain his kingdom, urged the young king to make peace with the Greeks and advance on the Roman strongholds of Apollonia and Epidamnos. Philip built a fleet of 100 small galleys, hoping to take the cities by surprise. However, his plans were thwarted when a messenger sent to form an alliance with Hannibal was captured while crossing the Adriatic. A large squadron of Roman quinqueremes was stationed near Brundisium, and Philip's plan to strike from the sea was left dead in the water. In 215 BC, Romans sent a praetor, Marcus Valerius Livinus, to Brundisium with 2 legions to guard the crossing into Italy. Livinus would go on to capture Agrigentum later in the war, but for now he was assigned to the Macedonian campaign. He was supported by around 50 quinqueremes. In 214, Philip launched surprise attacks on Apollonia and Oricum. He couldn't capture Apollonia, but a smaller Oricum was an easy target. Livinus then crossed the Adriatic and expelled the Macedonians from Oricum. He subsequently relieved Apollonia and took up a defensive position in the city. Beaten back, the Macedonians didn't commit any further attacks on the Roman strongholds in Illyria. The Greek theater was different from the other parts of the Second Punic War. The Romans had only a limited presence in Greece, and the First Macedonian War was mostly a conflict between the Greeks and the Macedonians. In 211, the Romans sent a delegation to the Aetolian League and they formed an alliance. The terms of this alliance are partially preserved on an inscription found in the Greek region of Acarnaria. The Aetolian League agreed to resume fighting against Philip with the support of at least 25 Roman quinqueremes. All territorial gains were to belong to the League, while the Romans were entitled to the captured spoils. This alliance ensured that Philip was preoccupied in Greece and unable to send an army into Italy. The attacks came suddenly, with Aetolians and Romans raiding coastal communities, while Illyrian chieftains made forays into northern Macedonia. Philip responded quickly to all these threats. The Macedonians had a professional army of 20,000 strong, the core of which was the Macedonian phalanx that had conquered the known world not so long ago. Philip rode at the head of his cavalry, reminiscent of his great predecessor. He managed to push back the enemy on several occasions, but the Aetolians never gathered their forces in one place, but rather chose to divide their men into numerous raiding parties. The First Macedonian War soon evolved into a regional conflict engulfing most of the Aegean. By the end of 210 BC, Elis, Sparta, and Pergamon joined the Aetolians, while the Achaean League sided with the Macedonians. That year, Livinus left Greece to serve as consul. During his term, he disbanded the remaining Roman legions still stationed in Apollonia. This just shows how little the Romans were actually invested in this conflict. Their main priority was, and still is, the large Carthaginian army freely roaming across Italy. Despite this disregard, Philip V was slowly but surely gaining the upper hand in Greece. Livy claims that Athens, the Ptolemies, and the island of Rhodes all sent delegations to Philip to urge him to stop his advance. If he conquered the League, he would gain an overwhelming power base in Greece, opening the doors to another power struggle among the Hellenistic kings of the Eastern Mediterranean. Despite this, Philip pushed on, and in 207 led a successful foray into the Aetolian League. In the same year, a reformed Achaean army shattered the Spartan forces in the Battle of Mantinea. Unlike the Romans, the Greek states were unwilling to continue fighting after a couple of crushing defeats, and the Aetolian League sued for peace in 206. The Romans now renewed their presence in the area, but they were still only interested in defending their holdings. They refused Philip's challenges to a pitched battle and remained safely behind the strong walls of Apollonia. With this stalemate unlikely to change, the two powers agreed on a peace treaty. Unlike any other Roman war up to this point, the First Macedonian War didn't end in complete surrender of one side. The Romans and the Macedonians agreed on peace terms as equals. Although the Romans managed to prevent Philip from aiding Hannibal at minimal cost, the vengeful Romans were not quick to forget the opportunistic alliance between Carthage and Macedonia during their greatest crisis. The stage was now set for the continuation of this conflict, but the Romans first had to deal with Hannibal. For all this time, we have neglected to talk about Iberia. Back when Hannibal first crossed the Alps, a Roman army under Scipio Calvus was sent into Spain. While Hannibal was winning major victories in Italy, his primary power base was threatened by the Scipio family. Their efforts proved crucial for Rome, as they delayed any potential reinforcements from the region. Gnaeus landed in Emporion with a single consular army, or roughly 20 to 25,000 men. They were supported by 60 quinqueremes. The Greeks were friendly to the Romans, giving them a convenient foothold on the Iberian Peninsula. Emporion would serve as their main base of operations for the duration of the war. Hanno was left north of the Ebro to keep watch on the pro-Roman tribes, namely the Bargusi. He lacked the troops needed to move against the Roman invasion. As Gnaeus slowly started marching south along the coast, many communities declared for Rome, while those that resisted were promptly attacked. Gnaeus reached Tarraco, a town not far from the Ebro, which surrendered to the approaching army. From there, Gnaeus turned inland, meeting Hanno near a place called Sissa. The Punic force was outnumbered 2-1 and they were easily defeated, suffering heavy casualties. Hanna was captured along with Indibilis, a chieftain of the pro-Carthaginian Ilergates. The Romans also secured large quantities of provisions left behind by Hannibal. Without a strong Carthaginian presence north of the Ebro, most tribes in the area now declared for Rome. Indibilis soon escaped captivity and with the help of his younger brother Mandonius, launched raids against the pro-Roman tribes. Gnaeus had to act quickly to protect his new allies. Soon the two brothers were pushed back, leaving our story for now. Hasdrubal Barca, who was stationed in Carthago Nova, rushed north with a small force of 8,000 foot and 1,000 horse. He used the confusion created by Indibilis and caught the Romans off guard. The Carthaginians defeated several Roman raiding parties near the coast. As many as 25 Roman ships were incapacitated. However, Hasdrubal didn't have the strength to face Scipio directly, and he had to fall back south of the Ebro. Gnaeus punished the officers responsible for these defeats and quickly restored order in the region. Despite these small setbacks, the Romans successfully established a foothold in Iberia, preventing Hasdrubal from sending aid to his brother in Italy. The following year, Hasdrubal gathered a large army, along with crews to man about 40 quinqueremes. This combined force marched up the coast towards the Roman enclave. The size of this army is unknown, but it's believed that it was a formidable force, given the fact that Gnaeus refused to meet it in battle. Instead, he boarded the remaining 35 ships with his legions and set off for a surprise attack. This fleet was supported by 20 smaller triremes, manned by exceptionally skilled Massalian sailors. The Carthaginian army was encamped near the mouth of the Ebro. Their scouts spotted the approach of the Roman fleet, and they too put to sea. Punic crews were mostly fresh recruits, and they were poorly trained. They had no chance against the experienced Roman sailors, and the battle was a decisive Roman victory. 4 Punic ships were sunk, and the others rushed for the safety of the shore. The Romans then hauled off 25 beach quinqueremes, crippling the Carthaginian navy. Witnessing this defeat, the Punic army lost heart and retreated back south. Encouraged by these victories, the Senate sent former consul Publius Cornelius Scipio with 8,000 troops to aid his brother. Publius had been wounded in the Battle of Ticinus, but he had made a full recovery by now. The Scipio brothers were given orders to stop Carthaginian reinforcements from reaching Italy at all costs. This combined force marched south towards Saguntum. A local chieftain, Abilix, sensed the winds of change blowing across Iberia and decided to side with the Romans. Back in 218, before departing for Italy, Hannibal gathered numerous Iberian hostages in Saguntum. Abilix convinced the Punic commander to give him these hostages to secure the help and friendship of their tribes. Up to that point, Abilix had been a loyal friend to Carthage, and he was allowed to take the prisoners. Instead of returning them to their homes, he handed them over to the Romans. The Scipio brothers used these hostages to win over their tribes and secure alliances. Rome was now seen as a generous ally compared to the heavy-handed Carthaginians. Abilix was handsomely rewarded for his part. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal was occupied with suppressing a rebellion on an Iberian tribe, the Turdetani, on the Baetis River. It's likely that they rebelled when Hasdrubal punished the crews of his ships following the previous defeat. In 216, while Hannibal was preparing his army on the fields of Cannae, Hasdrubal received small reinforcements from Carthage with orders to march to Italy. However, he didn't have enough troops to both secure the Spanish holdings and to aid Hannibal simultaneously. When yet another army crossed into Spain, Hasdrubal gained the confidence to march against the Scipio brothers. In early 215, the Punic force moved towards the Ebro, meeting the Romans near the town of Iberia. The sizes of the armies are unknown, but it's suspected that they were roughly the same. The Romans deployed in the usual triple-axis formation with cavalry on the wings. Hasdrubal placed his Spanish troops in the center, Libyans on the left, and the Carthaginians on the right. His cavalry and elephants were divided between the wings. Hasdrubal's deployment was reminiscent of his brother's, but unlike his brother, he couldn't hold his center. The Spanish troops quickly broke under the weight of the Roman legions. The reserves then rushed through the created gaps, separating the two wings of the Punic army. Seeing their center fail, the Carthaginians fell into a complete rout. The usually superior Punic cavalry did little fighting during the battle. Hannibal's charisma and tactical brilliance, combined with years of campaigning in Iberia and Italy, created a bond between the general and his men. He could count on them to stand by his side during his greatest hardships. The prolonged resistance of the Spanish center at Cannae won Hannibal his greatest victory. Hasdrubal had no such bond with his men, and his army quickly collapsed. With it, the prospects of another Carthaginian army leaving Spain for Italy were shattered. Following this defeat, the Carthaginians first diverted Mago Barca and his army to the peninsula, and later sent another army with Hasdrubal Gisco. As we have previously mentioned, the years after Cannae are poorly documented. Polybius' account is lost, while Livy presents numerous problems and inconsistencies. Following the disaster at Cannae, the Romans were in no position to send aid to the Scipio brothers, and they were left to fend for themselves. Hasdrubal still controlled a large part of the peninsula and could more easily recruit new troops and gather supplies. However, controlling this larger area forced the Carthaginians to split their forces in order to defend their allies and suppress rebellions across the region. 3 separate armies were formed, led by Hasdrubal, Mago, and Hasdrubal Gisco respectively. There is some evidence of disagreements among the generals. They acted separately in their immediate areas of control, avoiding each other as much as possible. Without a concerted effort between the 3 armies, there was no hope of dislodging the Roman forces in the north. The Scipio brothers sent frequent raids on Carthaginian territory, slowly expanding their influence in the region. But without serious aid from Italy, they too couldn't hope to break the stalemate and overwhelm the Barcan forces. The Senate at least approved some shipments of supplies to aid their effort. Merchants contracted to ferry these supplies cheated the state by sending empty ships and claiming they were lost at sea for huge profits. This caused a great scandal in Rome, as such instances of profiteering at the expense of the state were still rare among the patriotic Romans. In 213, the Romans sent a delegation to the Numidian king Syphax. Sensing an opportunity to expand his holdings, he agreed to an alliance with the Romans. Among the delegation was a centurion, Quintus Statorius, who distinguished himself in the Spanish campaign. He was left behind with the Numidians, with orders to drill and discipline their infantry. Statorius would train the Numidians in the Roman arts of infantry warfare. He taught them to maintain formation, perform complex maneuvers, and even build effective fortifications. The Numidians, who relied heavily on their cavalry, could now field a competent infantry unit. With this new force, Syphax launched an attack on the eastern Numidians, ruled by King Galla, who was an ally of Carthage. Appian claims that Hasdrubal Barca left Spain with a large force to push back Syphax, but this is not supported by other writers. It's possible that Appian confused him with some other general named Hasdrubal. Whatever the case may be, Syphax was pushed back for now, and Hasdrubal was free to continue his Spanish campaign. Numidian prince Massinissa, son of King Galla, now crossed into Iberia along with 3,000 Numidian cavalry to aid the Punic efforts. In 212 BC, the Scipio brothers marched even further south, capturing Saguntum. After nearly 7 years, the town was finally back on the Roman side. But by this time, most of the formerly loyal populace was gone, and the situation in the Mediterranean was very different. The brothers also secured an alliance with the nearby Celtiberians. The following year, in 211, the Romans decided to mount a full-scale invasion of Punic Iberia. The Scipio brothers gathered their legions, numbering 30,000 men by some estimates. They were joined by 20,000 Celtiberian mercenaries. This combined force crossed the Ebro and advanced toward the Carthaginians. Hasdrubal Barca was encamped near a town called Amtorgis, in the upper Baetis valley. Mago and Hasdrubal Gisco combined their forces, and they were about 5 days' march away from Amtorgis, near Castulo. The sizes of the Carthaginian armies are unknown, but it's believed that they outnumbered the Romans and their allies. As the Romans approached the Baetis valley, they realized that the Carthaginian forces were divided. Overly confident, the Scipio brothers decided to split their army and go after the 2 parts separately. Publius marched off with around 20,000 Roman legionaries. Neus was left with the remaining 10,000 Roman troops and the Celtiberian allies. With this force he faced Hasdrubal Barca. While Publius was marching towards Mago and Gisco, he was harassed by Massinissa and his Numidians. The 2 brothers, Indibilis and Mandonius, leading a contingent of 7,500 Iberians, moved in to cover the Roman line of retreat. Realizing he was in danger of encirclement, Publius turned around and marched under the cover of darkness towards the Iberians. In the early morning, he surprised Indibilis, and a confusing action was fought. Neither side could form an effective fighting line, but the Roman numerical superiority gave them the edge. However, the Iberians managed to hold off long enough for Massinissa to arrive. Things turned from bad to worse for the Romans, as they now had to defend from both sides. The rest of the Punic cavalry then closed in, and the Romans stood no chance. Publius Scipio was slain while encouraging his men from the front lines. Seeing their commander fall, the Roman army broke and fled, but the fleeing army was easy pickings for the nimble cavalry. Mago and Gisco now marched to aid Hasdrubal, but their help was not strictly necessary. While Gnaeus Scipio was encamped near the Punic army, Hasdrubal negotiated with the Celtiberians in secret. The Celtiberian mercenaries were loyal only to gold, and a large bribe convinced them to abandon their allies. The whole army simply marched off, leaving the Romans to fend for themselves. When Mago and Gisco arrived near his camp, Gnaeus realized he was vastly outnumbered. Without any news from his brother, the Romans left their camp at night, hoping to reach the safety of the Ebro. Even though they had a head start, Massinissa and his Numidians soon caught up to them. Slowed down by frequent attacks, the Romans took up a defensive position on a hilltop. They used the baggage to create a defensive perimeter, but the rest of the Punic army soon closed in, and the perimeter was quickly broken. Gnaeus was killed, and most of his army was destroyed. For 7 years, the Scipio brothers made steady progress in Iberia. While the Romans were suffering defeats and setbacks across the Mediterranean, they could always look to Iberia and their small victories. The brothers slowly expanded their web of alliances across the peninsula, and their presence was enough not only to prevent reinforcements from Spain from reaching Italy, but also to divert forces from Hannibal to the peninsula. Defeat at the Battle of Batis Valley came unexpectedly. Hasdrubal's years spent among the Iberian tribes gave him an upper hand in negotiations, and the usual Roman overconfidence cost them dearly. The Roman hold over Iberia was shattered, and the Carthaginians re-established their supremacy in the region. An equestrian, Lucius Marcius, rallied the remnants of the armies and fled north to the Ebro. Most of Rome's allies quickly abandoned them, and Marcius managed to hold only a small enclave in the north. Following the successful siege of Capua in 211 BC, some of the Roman forces were freed up, allowing the Senate to finally send aid to Iberia. Praetor Claudius Nero was sent to Spain with around 10,000 troops. He joined up with Marcius on the river Ebro and swiftly reorganized the remnants of the Scipio army, preparing them for a possible invasion from the Punic forces. According to Livy, Nero led a daring campaign south of the Ebro, successfully trapping Hasdrubal Barca. While negotiating his ransom with the Romans, Hasdrubal slipped out of the blockade, and Nero returned north with nothing to show for it. These events are often questioned, and it's hard to believe that Nero would choose to mount an invasion so soon after the great disasters faced by the Scipios. Whatever the case may be, Nero was soon recalled to Rome. The reasons for his rapid removal from the region are debated. Some believe that Nero lacked the gravitas to negotiate with Spanish chieftains, while others claim that a capable commander was needed back in Italy. His removal opened the door for the arrival of the most notable general of the era. The Cornelii Scipiones were among the most influential families in Roman politics. The first member of the family to ascend to the highest position in office was Publius Cornelius Maluginensis Scipio, who served as a consular tribune in 395 BC. We have previously mentioned his great-grandson, Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, who served as consul in 298. He is known for his campaign against the Etruscans during the Third Samnite War. His two sons, Lucius and Gnaeus Asina, both served as consuls during the First Punic War, garnering even more influence for the family. The two sons of Lucius, Gnaeus Calvus and Publius, also served as consuls and spent years campaigning in Spain. There are also other consuls and notable men from this family that we haven't mentioned before, but one man would rise above them all. Hailed as Rome's first Imperator, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later named Africanus, was arguably the greatest of all Roman generals. Still in his teens, on the eve of Hannibal's invasion of Italy, Scipio would rise to challenge one of Rome's most formidable adversaries. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus was born in 235 BC. Although he would earn his cognomen Africanus only later in life after defeating Hannibal, we will use it throughout the series to more easily distinguish him from the rest of his family. Publius was first mentioned in the historical record in 218 BC when his father, also named Publius, was elected consul and sent against Hannibal. Young Publius, who was 17 at the time, accompanied his father, having been appointed to his cavalry escort. In the first battle of the war, the Battle of Ticinus, Africanus rode alone into the front line to save his wounded father. Some of his critics would claim this feat was performed by a Ligurian slave and later appropriated by the fame-hungry Scipio. However, it is unlikely that a slave would be armed and on horseback in the midst of a battle. During the following disaster at Trebia, Publius likely stayed back at the camp with his wounded father. With the elder Publius sent off to Spain in 217, Africanus was likely not present for the second disaster at Lake Trasimene. He would, however, follow his father-in-law, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, to Cannae as one of the military tribunes of the Second Legion. Young men had to serve at least 5 years in the army before being appointed as military tribunes. But as we shall soon see, the Romans were quick to bend the rules in times of crisis. As we have previously discussed, the Battle of Cannae is one of the greatest disasters in Roman military history. Upwards of 50,000 Romans, including Paulus and other lesser commanders, perished on that day. Only a small group of infantrymen managed to break through and escape to the surrounding countryside. Among these was, of course, Scipio Africanus. He and other tribunes managed to gather the survivors at Canusium. There, he overheard some wealthy young men planning an escape out of Italy. Drawing up his sword, Scipio made them swear an oath not to abandon the Republic in its greatest hour of need. The second consul Vero then arrived at Canusium and took control of what remained of the once great army. These disasters must have played a crucial part in shaping young Scipio's views on military tactics. While the Roman armies were collapsing around him, he would learn from Rome's greatest adversary, eventually even surpassing him. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The details of his career after Cannae are shrouded in mystery. He likely served in Italy, or possibly in Sicily, alongside other survivors from Cannae. In 213 BC, he was elected a curule aedile. A tribune of the plebs protested his appointment, as he had not yet reached the required age to hold this office. However, due to overwhelming support from the voting assembly, the tribune stepped down, allowing Scipio to hold the office. Only 22 at the time, Scipio proclaimed, "If all the citizens wish to make me aedile, I am old enough." As a curule aedile, he spent large amounts of money on festival games in honor of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. This made the aspiring politician even more popular within the city. In 211, the news of the deaths of Publius and Gnaeus Scipio reached Italy. The news shocked not only the young Publius, but the whole of Rome. Their most successful theater of war was devastated, and their control of Iberia was shattered. The fears of Hasdrubal Barca following in his brother's footsteps and crossing the Alps weighed heavily on every Roman. Gaius Claudius Nero was sent to organize the remnants of the Scipio forces, but he was recalled to Rome in 210. Seeing no hope for glory in the far west, none of the Roman generals put forth their names for the command of the region. To the astonishment of the crowd gathered on the Campus Martius, young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the late Publius, announced his candidacy. He was only 25 at the time. With the memory of his father still fresh in everyone's mind and his popularity at a high, Scipio was unanimously elected. As we have already seen, the Romans would bend some rules when the need arose, but this move was entirely unprecedented. To explain why, we will need to take a moment to examine the Roman cursus honorum, or the political ladder of ancient Rome. There were numerous political offices in Rome, but we'll only focus on those relevant here. The lowest rank in the cursus honorum was the military tribune. These were officers in the Roman army, and each legion was assigned 6 tribunes. As we have already mentioned, the men had to serve at least 5 years in the military before being eligible for the office. Although not strictly required for moving up the political ladder, most ambitious men served as military tribunes to bolster their political careers. This would be changed by Sulla's reforms when the office became mandatory. Scipio was appointed to the office at the age of 19 after serving only a year or two in the military. The next step on the cursus honorum was the quaestor. Quaestors supervised the treasury, audited funds, and collected taxes. When assigned to a consular army, they were responsible for managing finances and dividing the spoils of war. All elected quaestors were appointed to the Senate. Publius skipped this step, never serving as a quaestor in his career. The next office was the optional curule aedile. They, along with the plebeian aediles, were responsible for the upkeep of the city of Rome, supervising public works, and organizing games and festivals. To be eligible for the office, one had to previously serve as a quaestor. Scipio was elected aedile when he was just 22, without meeting the previous requirement. Above the aediles were the praetors, and finally the consuls. Praetors and consuls were the only offices that held imperium, or the power to rule. As such, only they could command the Roman army. Later in life, Publius would be elected consul, but for now he was merely a private citizen. He never held imperium, and although eligible, he was not yet appointed to the Senate. For the first time in the history of the Republic, a young man barely entering the cursus honorum was suddenly appointed a proconsul and granted imperium, thus bypassing all established laws and customs. With no command experience to speak of, Scipio would take over one of the most important theaters of the war. His close childhood friend, Publius Licinius Crassus, serving as Pontifex Maximus, saw no problem with Scipio's appointment. Although the young Publius had his critics in the Senate, they chose to remain silent, as one of the greatest gambles in the history of the Republic was unfolding before their eyes. Having made all the necessary preparations, Scipio sailed to Iberia with 10,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. He chose Marcus Junius Silanus to accompany him. Silanus was an older man with experience, having served as praetor in 212 BC. Scipio was also accompanied by his close friend Gaius Laelius, who would serve as his second-in-command. The situation in Spain was not as dire as was feared in Rome. The remnants of the Roman army were well organized, and some coastal allies remained loyal. Meanwhile, the three generals, Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and Hasdrubal Gisco, who had united to defeat the Scipiones the previous year, had now fallen out. Mago headed southwest to Algarve, Hasdrubal was north of the Tagus, fighting the Carpetani, and Gisco was in the far west near the mouth of the Tagus. All of them were more than 10 days' march from the capital of Punic Spain, Carthago Nova. Scipio spent the rest of 210 gathering intelligence on his adversaries and preparing the army for the upcoming campaigning season. Learning the location of the Carthaginian generals, Publius chose a daring course of action. Unlike his father, who slowly marched south, capturing strongholds and securing allies, Africanus decided to march directly on Carthago Nova. Secrecy was the key to his success, and he only shared his plans with Laelius. Thus, in early 209, Scipio set off with 25,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. Silanus was left at the Ebro with 3,500 troops. Laelius commanded a squadron of 35 quinqueremes that accompanied the marching army. According to our sources, Scipio crossed this great distance in just 7 days. Carthago Nova was situated on a small peninsula, accessible only from the narrow isthmus on the eastern side. On its southern side stood one of the best natural harbors in Spain. North of the city was a shallow lagoon connected to the sea by a man-made canal. Although it had strong natural defenses, the city was poorly manned. The garrison commander, another Mago, had only 1,000 mercenaries along with some 2,000 armed townsfolk. When the Romans arrived near the city, Scipio gave a rousing speech to his men. He told them Neptune had revealed the plan to him in a dream and promised great rewards for the first man to scale the walls. Speed was now of the utmost essence, and without allowing the men to rest, Scipio soon launched an attack on the city. The outnumbered Carthaginians made a desperate sortie, but they were easily repelled. Failing to follow the fleeing troops through the gates, Scipio sent ladders to scale the walls. Laelius and the fleet lined up beneath the walls and showered the defenders with missiles. Making no headway, Scipio sounded a retreat and the men returned to the camp. It was customary to allow troops several days' rest after such an assault. However, Scipio sent 500 carefully chosen men to the far side of the lagoon. The fishermen he questioned during the winter told him that in the afternoons the water in the lagoon receded enough for men to cross on foot. To the surprise of the exhausted defenders, Scipio launched another, even fiercer attack. Mago, lacking the troops to defend the entire city, concentrated his forces on the eastern and southern sides. This left part of the northern wall undefended. The special force seized this opportunity and scaled the walls. Encountering only limited resistance, they rushed east and opened the city gates. Seeing the men cross the water successfully, the Romans believed Neptune was aiding them in the assault, and they pushed on with great resolve. The defenses were finally broken, and the looting of the city began. Scipio took 1,000 of his men and encircled Mago in the citadel. Once the commander surrendered, Scipio ordered a stop to the plundering. There are some issues with this narrative, notably the crossing of the lagoon. The outflow that would significantly lower the water level is difficult to explain. It's also unlikely that the men carrying ladders could march around the lagoon and cross it without being noticed by the defenders on the walls. It's more likely that the men rushed along the southern shore of the lagoon and found an unguarded section of the wall. Whatever the case may be, Scipio scored the first of his many spectacular victories. It was now time to divide the spoils. Large amounts of gold, silver, food, siege engines and weapons were found in the city. 8,000 surviving citizens were allowed to leave with their families. 2,000 slaves were offered to work for Rome with the promise of freedom in the future. ship crews and merchants were recruited into the Roman navy. The high-ranking Carthaginians, including Mago, were kept as prisoners. While dividing the spoils, a dispute arose between two soldiers. A centurion, Quintus Trebellius, and a marine, Sextus Digitius, both claimed they were the first to scale the walls. Supported by their officers and their fellow soldiers, the dispute was about to boil over. Stepping in, Scipio thoroughly examined the evidence and after a lengthy debate, decided to honor both men by awarding each the Golden Crown. This act further increased the admiration the men held for their general. 300 Spanish hostages were freed from the city. They were treated well and returned to their families. Scipio would use them as leverage to secure alliances with Spanish tribes. Among these prisoners was a particularly beautiful young woman, whom the men offered to their leader as a great prize. He reluctantly refused them and returned the girl to her father. This event would be romanticized throughout history, further elevating the myth of the great general. The fall of Carthago Nova was a heavy hit to the Carthaginians, both politically as it had been the seat of their power ever since it was established by Hasdrubal the Fair 18 years earlier, but also militarily. Resources and prisoners captured in the city would be used with great effect by the young Scipio. However, 3 large Punic armies still roamed freely across Iberia, and the fate of the peninsula was yet to be decided on the field of battle. Laelius sailed off to Rome, carrying the news and valuable prisoners, while Scipio spent the rest of the year rigorously training his armies in New Carthage. From what we can gather, the Punic generals were not in contact with each other, and none of them made a move against Scipio. Leaving a strong garrison in the city, Scipio returned to his winter quarters in Tarraco. There he hosted some Spanish chieftains who came to thank him for returning their families and to form new alliances. One of these chieftains was a man named Edeco, leader of the Edetani. After receiving his wife and kids, Edeco flattered Scipio by calling him a king. In early 208, Scipio was preparing for a campaign against one of the Punic armies. He drew in men from the navy to his legions, gathering some 30,000 troops. When he crossed the Ebro, he was intercepted by Indibilis, one of the closest allies of Carthage, and a man partly responsible for the death of his father. However, things had changed since late 211. Some of the prisoners in Carthago Nova were the wife and daughters of his brother Mandonius, and the chieftains broke off their alliance with the Punic generals. Now that Scipio had returned the prisoners, the brothers pledged loyalty to Rome and joined Scipio with 5,000 fresh troops. They too saluted Scipio as a king. It's clear that Hasdrubal's methods were not on par with his great predecessors, and the barked hold of Iberia was slowly shattering. Scipio continued his march deep inside enemy territory, meeting Hasdrubal Barca in the upper Baetis Valley near Baecula. When the barked general learned of the Roman approach, he didn't send word to his fellow generals, nor did he attempt to set a trap. Instead, he decided to wait for Scipio on open ground, setting up his camp on a well-defended hilltop. In all likelihood, Hasdrubal was reluctant to meet Scipio in battle, having made preparations to finally march to Italy. Scipio sent out his skirmishers, supported by heavy infantry, to ascend the hill. Hasdrubal's light troops slowly gave way, and he ordered the rest of his army to form up. Meanwhile, Scipio divided his main force in two, with him commanding the left wing and Laelius the right. They reached the summit before the Punic troops had a chance to form an effective battle line. Seeing no hope of stopping the Roman onslaught, Hasdrubal decided to retreat. According to Roman historians, Hasdrubal fled the field even before the battle had started. In the ensuing pursuit, as many as 12,000 Carthaginian troops were slain or captured. Hasdrubal and the remnants of his army escaped north across the Tagus. From there, they started a long and perilous march towards Italy. Lacking the strength to stop him, Scipio could only hope that the Italian forces would defeat this weakened army before they met up with Hannibal. In the aftermath of the battle, many tribes of the upper Baetis Valley came to congratulate Scipio. He was once more greeted as a king. As we are well aware, the Romans had an innate hatred for kings. If the Senate caught wind of these proclamations, Scipio could face serious trouble, and if he was seen encouraging them, his life would likely be forfeit. Instead, Scipio asked the Spaniards to simply call him general. If we are to believe Livy, he used the term Imperator, adding that the soldiers had already given him this title. If true, this would make Scipio Africanus the first Roman Imperator. At this time, the word simply meant commander, but later it would be used for victorious Roman generals and eventually emperors. There are no other records linking the title Imperator to Scipio. However, when his brother-in-law Lucius Aemilius Paulus was appointed governor of Spain in 189, he began using the title, perhaps in reference to this event. Following his victory, Scipio returned to Tarraco, where he would spend the rest of the year in relative calm. The Carthaginians sent a new general, Hanno, with some reinforcements to aid their forces in Iberia. He and Mago would march to central Iberia in order to recruit new fighters among the Celt-Iberian tribes. The following year, Lucius Scipio was sent to join his elder brother in Spain. While Publius stayed behind in Tarraco, he sent Silanus with 10,000 foot and 500 horse to try and stop further recruitment of the Celt-Iberians. Silanus marched in secret and surprised the Punic generals. While Mago managed to escape with his army, Hanno was captured before he had a chance to fight. With this victory under their belt, Scipio marched in full force towards Gades and the two Punic generals. Sensing the shift in the balance of power, most of the Spanish allies north of the Betis were now abandoning Carthage. Hasdrubal Gisco, unwilling to risk an open battle, dispersed his men among the garrisons of loyal cities. With the supply line stretched thin, Scipio was forced to return to Tarraco, where he spent the rest of the year. While 207 was uneventful in Spain, Hasdrubal barked across the Alps in early spring and was moving south with great speed. We will, however, first finish the narrative in Spain before returning to Italy. During the winter, Hasdrubal Gisco gathered an immense force, numbering 70,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 32 war elephants according to Polybius, or 50,000 infantry and 4,500 cavalry according to Livy. With this large army, he marched to the town of Ilipa on the lower Betis. On the other side of Iberia, Scipio gathered 45,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. Half of his army was comprised of allied Spanish tribes. Having made all necessary preparations, Scipio advanced to finally meet Hasdrubal Gisco in battle. As the Romans were setting up their camp opposite the Carthaginians, Mago led a sudden cavalry charge. Having anticipated such disruptions, Scipio concealed some of his cavalry behind one of the hills. As the Punic horsemen approached the camp, the concealed cavalry sprang into action and attacked the Carthaginians from the flank. Surprised, the Punic cavalry retreated back to safety, and the Romans were free to finish their camp in peace. Over the following days, as the two armies observed each other, the generals deployed in the usual manner. Hasdrubal placed his best heavy troops, the Libyans, in the center, his Spanish allies on the flanks, and cavalry and elephants in front of the battle line. Scipio did the same, with his heavy legions in the center, his Spanish allies on the wing, and cavalry in the front. When Scipio finally decided to offer battle, he ordered his men to rise before the first light and prepare for combat. Well rested and fed, they marched out of the camp. Scipio ordered his cavalry to charge the Punic line and draw them out. Suddenly woken up, the Carthaginians had no time to eat and had to march out with great haste. Drawn cavalry was ordered to prolong the skirmish with their counterparts as long as possible. Still tired, hungry, thirsty, and baking in the midday sun, the Punic forces waited desperately for the battle to begin. This tactic closely resembles Hannibal's methods at Trebia, where the hungry and freezing Romans faced well-prepared Carthaginians. Clear evidence that Scipio was studying his great rival from the very beginning. In this confusion, Hasdrubal failed to realize that Scipio had altered his formation. He placed the Spanish allies in the center, while the heavy legions were split between the two wings. Right commanded by himself and Lelius, and the left by Silanus and Lucius Marcius, an equestrian who saved the remnants of the army after the disasters at Upper Betis in 211. Scipio finally signaled his cavalry to fall back, and his infantry started a slow march towards the Punic line. The wings formed in two narrow columns and advanced ahead of the Spanish troops. Hasdrubal did nothing as he watched the Romans close in. When they reached the enemy line, the Romans threw missiles at the elephants and the cavalry, causing a stampede and forcing them away from the battlefield. They then wheeled around and engaged the Spanish flanks. Eventually, they were joined by their Spanish allies, who engaged the Libyan center. Under the immense pressure from the heavy legions, the Punic flanks gave way. What started as a slow, controlled retreat turned into a complete rout. An outbreak of a sudden thunderstorm saved the Carthaginians from certain doom. The next day, the Spanish allies abandoned Hasdrubal, and seeing the writing on the wall, he ordered a full retreat. They were pursued by the Romans, and only around 6,000 men managed to reach a mountain top where they were encircled. Realizing there was no hope of saving their men, Hasdrubal and Mago made a hasty escape, leaving their men stranded. Hasdrubal Gisco sailed to Africa, while Mago fled first to Gades and then to the Balearic Islands, where he hoped to recruit more fresh troops for the Italian campaign. Leaderless, the last remnants of the Carthaginian army in Spain disbanded and surrendered to the Romans. In just 4 short years, Scipio ended the 400 years of Carthaginian presence in Iberia. The Spanish tribes in southern Iberia now flocked to the Roman side, and the era of Roman Hispania began. It would take the Romans almost 200 years to finally complete the conquest of the peninsula. In the Battle of Ilipa, Scipio took a huge risk by splitting his line. A skilled general like Hannibal could have easily exploited this self-inflicted weakness and punished his enemy. However, Hasdrubal Gisco was no great general, and on that day luck favored the bold Scipio Africanus. Roman troops displayed a higher level of discipline than anything present at the start of the war. The long years of campaigning in Italy, Spain and Sicily had made the Roman legions an unstoppable force we know today. In contrast to the olden days, the legions remained deployed for years at a time, allowing commanders to drill them into the best fighting force in the Mediterranean. It would now only take a handful of competent generals for the Romans to conquer the known world. The loyalties of the Spanish tribes were tied to the great generals personally, rather than to nation-states as a whole. When Scipio then fell ill and a rumor of his death spread across the peninsula, some of these tribes rebelled against Rome. Indibilis, seeing an opportunity, called upon other Iberian and Celtiberian chieftains and launched a raid into Roman territory. When Scipio finally recovered, he gathered an army and crushed the Spaniards. Indibilis managed to escape, but he would be killed only a year later when he rose up again. Having secured Iberia, Scipio sailed to Africa to the court of the Numidian king Syphax. He hoped to rekindle all ties his father had previously made with the Numidians. To his surprise, Hasdrubal Gisco and his officers were already at the court of the Numidian king. Syphax found this very amusing and he prepared a banquet for the two generals. It is said that Scipio secured favorable terms with the king, however they would not bear fruit. Syphax would ultimately turn to Carthage. Back in Iberia, the other Numidian king, Massinissa, a staunch ally of the Barcids, was disillusioned with the new leadership. Seeing the Punic commanders had abandoned their men, Massinissa contacted the Romans in secret. He was allowed to freely return to Africa, leaving on friendly terms with Scipio. He would still have a crucial role to play before this war came to an end. While campaigning in Spain, Scipio realized that the only way to end the war was an invasion of Africa. Ever since Sempronius abandoned his preparations in early 218, the idea of mounting an invasion was out of the realm of possibilities. Now, however, with the conquest of Spain, the Carthaginian source of power and wealth was eliminated, and several veteran legions were freed up. Leaving Silanus and Lucius Manlius in charge of Iberia, Scipio returned to Rome at the end of 206. There he would prepare for his magnum opus, invasion of Africa and the final defeat of Hannibal Barca. But before we can follow him south, we first need to return to Hasdrubal's invasion of Italy. Back in 211 BC, the Roman capture of Capua marked a turning point in the Italian campaign. With the loss of their main ally in Italy, Hannibal was on the back foot and many Italian communities decided to abandon his cause. Those who surrendered voluntarily were treated well by the Romans, while those who were taken by an assault experienced the worst of Roman wrath. In 210, the Romans sent two armies into Apulia. One under the consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus was besieging Salapia, while the other under the proconsul Gnaeus Fulvius Centumalus moved in to blockade Herdonia. Salapia was betrayed from within and quickly captured. Following this victory, Marcellus advanced into Samnium, leaving Centumalus isolated in Apulia. The proconsul was then surprised by Hannibal's main force. In the Second Battle of Herdonia, Hannibal killed Centumalus, 11 out of the 12 military tribunes, and most of the Roman army. The survivors escaped into Samnium, meeting up with Marcellus. Although Hannibal did occasionally defeat small Roman armies, this represented only a tiny part of the combined force serving in Italy. Hundreds of thousands of men were deployed across southern Italy, and the Punic general could not cover the whole peninsula simultaneously. In 209 BC, Quintus Fabius Maximus was elected consul for the fifth and final time. He would get the opportunity to retake the other important town in the south. Ever since Tarentum was captured by Hannibal in 212 BC, a Roman garrison remained within the citadel. The garrison was well supplied by the Roman navy, which fought several hard battles to break the blockade of the harbor. A detachment of Bruttian soldiers stationed in the city decided to betray the Carthaginians and sent word to Fabius.
While Hannibal was engaged with Marcellus outside Canusium, Fabius marched in secret to southern Italy. When Fabius launched an attack on the city, the group of Bruttian soldiers helped his men climb the walls. Once inside Tarentum, the Romans killed indiscriminately, easily overwhelming the Punic force. An immense booty, along with 30,000 slaves, was taken from the city. By the time Hannibal arrived to aid Tarentum, the siege was already over. For his victory, Fabius Maximus was awarded the second triumph of his career. Already in his 70s by this point, Fabius would never again lead the Romans in battle. Although initially shunned by a large majority of Romans for his cowardice back in 217, by the end of his career he was seen as the savior of Rome. His nickname, Cunctator, meaning the delayer, first given as an insult, was now a point of pride for the old general. With each passing year, his strategy of avoiding pitched battles with Hannibal was bearing fruit. The final years of his political career were marked by opposition to the young Scipio Africanus, arguing against his planned invasion of Africa. Although his early career is not recorded, he most likely served in the First Punic War, being around 16 when the war broke out. Like many other Romans of his generation, Fabius spent the better part of his life embroiled in this conflict for the supremacy of the Western Mediterranean. Fabius fell ill and passed away in 203 before he could witness the final victory on the fields of Zama and the surrender of Carthage. Following the fall of Tarentum in 209, one of the Samnite tribes, the Hirpini and the Lucanians, surrendered to Rome. They were reprimanded by the Senate but were not punished for their disobedience. The Bruttians, the last defectors still loyal to Hannibal, were offered the same favorable terms. However, although some nobles wished to accept, others remained hesitant. The Romans were gradually winning this war of attrition, but not all communities could bear this continuous strain on their manpower. 12 of the 30 Latin colonies, forming the core of the Roman network of allies, declared that they could no longer sustain the war effort. This was not a sign of disobedience from the Latins, but rather a stark reminder that this war could not continue indefinitely. The remaining Latin cities, fearing retribution from Rome, promptly reiterated their willingness to continue fighting. In 208, Marcellus was elected consul for the fifth and final time. This came only 2 years after his previous appointment, showing that the Romans had completely abandoned tradition in favor of a more pragmatic solution. He and his colleague, Titus Quinctius Crispinus, fielded large armies in southern Italy. While on a reconnaissance mission, the two consuls, accompanied by some 200 horsemen, were ambushed by Hannibal's Numidian cavalry. Marcellus was killed in the initial assault, while Crispinus was mortally wounded. The loss of 2 consuls in a single skirmish was a heavy blow to Roman morale. Hannibal treated the body of one of his greatest adversaries with respect, allowing him a proper funeral. He sent his ashes in a silver urn back to Rome. He did, however, try to exploit this situation and recapture Salapia. He used Marcellus's signet ring to send a sealed message, instructing them to let him into the city. 600 Roman deserters, still wearing their uniforms, marched to Salapia. However, before Crispinus died, he sent messengers to all nearby towns, informing them of the recent events. When the deserters entered Salapia, the gates were shut behind them and they were slaughtered. Ever since Hannibal crossed the Alps, he hoped for reinforcements to aid his efforts. Although one small army did arrive from Carthage in 215, he was hoping for fresh troops from Iberia. He left his brother Hasdrubal in charge of the Spanish forces with orders to follow him to Italy. Hasdrubal had planned an expedition back in 216, but the successes of the Scipio brothers prevented him from leaving the peninsula. 8 years later, after suffering a defeat from Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Baecula, he finally set out for Italy. He spent large amounts of gold to bribe the Gallic tribes and recruit mercenaries. Unlike his brother, Hasdrubal encountered no opposition and easily crossed into Italy in the early spring of 207 BC. The Romans were not caught completely off guard. When the Punic forces passed through southern Gaul, the Massalians sent word to Rome, allowing them time to prepare. The news of this advance caused another great panic in the city. The Romans were still dealing with the aftermath of one barked general crossing the Alps at the head of an army, and here was another barked leading yet another army. However, the situation was quite different from the one in 218. The number of active troops far exceeded that at the start of the war. These men were better trained and a lot more experienced, and perhaps most importantly, the Romans had a fair number of capable generals currently active in Italy. Hasdrubal was seen as a threat in his own right, but if he joined up with Hannibal, the results could be disastrous. The Romans could recognize this, and they would try to prevent it at all costs. The Punic force would once again need to choose a path east or west of the Apennines, and again the Romans sent 2 armies to cover both options. The consul Marcus Livius Salinator was sent to Arminium to hold the eastern path. There he joined forces with the praetor, Lucius Porcius Licinus, who had 2 understrength legions under his command. Varro, serving as a pro-praetor, was sent to Etruria to cover the other side of the Apennines. Meanwhile, the other consul, Gaius Claudius Nero, was stationed in the south, shadowing Hannibal's movements. In early 207, when Hasdrubal crossed into Italy, he besieged Placentia, hoping for an early victory. However, the defenders proved more resilient than he had expected, and he was forced to abandon the assault. Realizing his top priority was finding his brother, Hasdrubal sent 6 riders to locate Hannibal. One of the riders was captured near Tarentum, and a sealed letter was discovered. The letter instructed Hannibal to meet this fresh force somewhere in Umbria. Having made the necessary preparations, Hasdrubal began his march south, choosing the eastern route along the Adriatic coast. Salinator and Licinus fell back towards Sena Gallica, where they decided to make a stand. Nero, who was in Canusium at the time, got word of these events. In a daring maneuver, more akin to Hannibal than to Roman commanders from the beginning of the war, Nero selected 6,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry and marched north. He sent word to all the towns in his way, ordering them to prepare food and supplies for his men, who would march unburdened. They were also ordered to make ready the carts that would carry the weary soldiers. As this column passed in great haste, crowds were gathering along their path to cheer them on. The Romans covered this great distance in less than a week. They entered the camp under the cover of darkness, without the Carthaginians realizing what had happened. The following morning, Nero persuaded his colleagues to use the element of surprise and offer battle immediately. Seeing the Roman army line up, Hasdrubal noticed something unusual, and he refused the challenge. During the day, his scouts spotted Nero and his army. Most likely outnumbered at this point, Hasdrubal decided to retreat. In the dead of night, he abandoned his camp and marched back towards the river Metaurus. The Punic force got lost in the dark and marched along the riverbank looking for a convenient crossing spot. Unable to cross, Hasdrubal started construction of a camp on a nearby hilltop. In the early morning, the Romans realized that the Carthaginians had fallen back and immediately gave chase. Nero, commanding the combined cavalry, led the way. Behind him was Licinus, leading the Velites, and finally Salinator with the main body of the army marched steadily behind them. As the different parts of the Roman army approached the Punic camp, they formed up for battle. Hasdrubal had no choice but to abandon the construction and answer the challenge. He placed his Spanish troops on the right and the less experienced Gauls on the left. The terrain was quite uneven, and the Gauls took up a formidable position on a small hill. The 10 elephants were placed in the center, in front of the infantry. Our ancient sources make no mention of the cavalry, but we can assume they were placed on the flatter ground to the right. The Romans deployed in the usual 3-line formation. Salinator commanded the left flank opposite the Spaniards. The bulk of the Roman cavalry was with him on the left. Nero was stationed on the right with his own detachments and presumably the allied cavalry. Licinus led the infantry in the center. The battle began with an effective elephant charge, throwing the Roman first line into disarray. However, the elephants soon fell into a panic frenzy, spreading confusion on both sides. The Punic attack continued with a charge from the Spanish right. These were experienced troops, and Salinator struggled to hold his line. Nero, unable to assail the Gallic forces, gathered some of his men and wheeled around the Roman line, attacking the Punic right. Surprised by this sudden onslaught, the Carthaginian forces collapsed into a full rout. Hasdrubal, seeing all hope was lost, fought bravely until the very end. The last great crisis of the war was averted. When the news of this victory reached Rome, both the people and the Senate rejoiced. Salinator, under whose auspices the battle was fought, was awarded a triumph. Nero received the lesser honor of an ovation. However, as the 2 generals marched proudly through the city, the crowds cheered more loudly for Nero, believing he was the true architect of this victory. All hopes of a Punic army reaching Hannibal died with his brother. The third brother, Mago, would also try to invade Italy, but his campaign never gathered much steam. In early 205, he sailed from the Balearic Islands to northern Italy. The Romans sent 4 legions to watch over him and prevent the army from moving south. The following year, Mago received some limited reinforcements from Carthage, but he couldn't utilize them effectively. Finally, in 203, he met the Romans in the Battle of Insubria. He was badly wounded, and witnessing his retreat, the Punic army collapsed. Soon after, Mago was recalled to Africa, but he died of his wounds while crossing the Mediterranean.
The two younger Barcid brothers fell far short of their great brother and father. Together they lost the most strategically important territory, the Iberian Peninsula. Their two invasions of Italy ultimately amounted to nothing. A large amount of resources diverted from Hannibal to aid their efforts could have been better spent supporting Hannibal directly. The Carthaginian failure to realize this might have given the Romans the chance to recover and finally strike back. We should now turn back to Scipio Africanus. In just 4 short campaigning seasons, Scipio achieved complete victory in Iberia. He returned to Rome in 205. As soon as he left the peninsula, Spanish tribes started rebelling against Roman rule as they were loyal to Scipio personally. However, the young general didn't care, as he had his sights on a far greater prize. Although he commanded Roman armies with remarkable efficiency, Scipio was still only a private citizen. As such, he was barred from entering the city before relinquishing his imperium. The Senate met Scipio outside the city walls, and while they praised his actions, they ultimately denied him a well-deserved triumph. Awarding a triumph to a private citizen was a step too far for the senators. Scipio stood for consular elections in 205. Although he was well below the minimum required age to hold the office, he was elected unanimously. His old friend, Publius Licinius Crassus, was elected the second consul. The consular provinces for the year were southern Italy and Sicily. Considering Crassus was the serving Pontifex Maximus, he had to remain in Italy, meaning Scipio was assigned Sicily. This played right into his hand, as he had already announced his intentions to launch an invasion of North Africa. Scipio faced some opposition from the Senate, most notably from Fabius Maximus. Fabius was old enough to remember the last Roman invasion of North Africa when Marcus Atilius Regulus crossed the Straits of Sicily back in 255 BC. This failed expedition prolonged the First Punic War for another 10 long years. Additionally, Hannibal was still leading an undefeated army in Bruttium. The Senate feared that Scipio, amidst all the popular support, could persuade the popular assembly to pass a law assigning him the province of Africa. This move would be legal, but entirely unprecedented. The Romans would not be ready for such a political crisis for another 100 years, and Scipio agreed to take Sicily with an explicit permission to cross into Africa. Although the war in Sicily had ended in 210 with the capture of Agrigentum, 2 veteran legions were still serving there. These were the survivors from Cannae, who were forced to serve as a punishment for that great disaster. They were joined by the survivors from the 2 defeated armies near Herdonia in 212 and 210. After serving for upwards of 10 years, a large part of this force was unfit for a perilous invasion of Africa. It was customary for a consul to levy 2 new legions when taking command. However, the recent tensions regarding his appointment made the Senate wary, and Scipio was unable to raise fresh troops. His invasion seemed doomed, but luckily Scipio's popularity sparked a wave of volunteers coming in from all parts of Italy. As many as 7,000 fresh troops arrived on the island. Scipio then asked for naval volunteers, and the response was again enthusiastic. 45 days later, Scipio had a fresh fleet of 30 ships along with their crews. This was in addition to the 30 ships already active in Sicily. Other communities sent supplies such as iron, timber, sails, grains, weapons, and tools. Scipio would in the end get his expedition. The general retired the old and unfit troops, finally relieving them of their duties. The volunteers were then used to bolster his army, forming 2 particularly large legions numbering 6,200 foot and 300 horse each. If the 2 allied legions were of roughly equal size, this would give Scipio around 25 to 30,000 troops. With the army gathered in Sicily, some historians wondered why Scipio didn't launch his invasion in 205. These troops were far from the professional standard of his Spanish legion, and Scipio would have to spend months drilling them into shape and preparing them for complex maneuvers. These careful preparations formed the backbone of Scipio's successes. The problem of supplying such a large army so far from home presented a challenge of its own. The shipping lanes in the Mediterranean were closed during winter, and the troops would have to rely on foraging. Considering all these factors, it's not a mystery why Scipio decided to delay the invasion until the following year. This would also allow him time to stockpile food he could carry with him to Africa. While he was preparing his land forces, his second-in-command, Gaius Laelius, was sent to raid the Carthaginian coastline. Laelius made contact with the Numidian prince Massinissa, who was currently embroiled in a civil war of succession. Massinissa was counting on Roman assistance, but he too would have to wait. Things were now in motion, and Scipio only needed to wait out the winter. he would need the Senate to prolong his command, and this was nearly guaranteed. However, an unexpected scandal nearly threw the whole plan into disarray. The last major city in Italy still loyal to Hannibal was Locri. Back in 216, when the communities in the south betrayed Rome, some loyal Locrians abandoned their homes and sought refuge in nearby Rhegium. Now, in 205, some Locrian craftsmen were captured by a Roman patrol and taken to Rhegium. Together with the refugees, they hatched a plan to betray the Carthaginian garrison and retake the town. The craftsmen were ransomed and returned to Locri, and Scipio, who was currently in Syracuse mending the wounds from the recent sack, was informed of the situation. Recognizing this as a great opportunity to recapture the last great harbor from Hannibal, Scipio sent 2 of his military tribunes to take the garrison from Rhegium and march on Locri. Flaminius, a pro-praetor currently positioned in Messana, was chosen to head this expedition. He took some troops from Sicily and joined forces with the tribunes. Meanwhile, Hannibal was positioned further north near Croton. As a side note, Hannibal left a memorial to his campaign in the Temple of Hera near Croton. Although this memorial is lost to history, it's believed that Polybius used it as a source for the number of troops at Hannibal's disposal during the early stages of his march to Italy. These accounts have survived, providing us with fairly accurate information on those early years of the war. Returning to the attack on Locri, the Romans managed to take the city with the help of the craftsmen. However, the Carthaginian garrison fell back to the safety of the citadel. Both generals acted quickly after receiving news of the attack. Hannibal marched south and Scipio boarded his ships with a small force and set sail for Locri. Hannibal arrived first, but his attack was unsuccessful. This allowed Scipio enough time to reinforce the city. We are told that the Punic force didn't notice his arrival. In the early morning, Scipio sallied out of the city, surprising Hannibal. Unwilling to risk further losses, the Carthaginian general withdrew. Seeing the relief force abandon them, the garrison snuck out of Locri, but not before setting fire to the citadel. Scipio won his first, albeit small, victory against his far more experienced opponent. Having been captured by force, the Locrians faced harsh punishment. However, things escalated beyond Scipio's wishes. The force occupying the city was split between the Rhegium garrison, commanded by the 2 tribunes, and the force that arrived with Flaminius. The latter, lacking the discipline of the former, began pillaging the occupied town. When the tribunes tried to stop further bloodshed, the 2 forces came to blows. The violence escalated, and Flaminius was captured by the garrison and mutilated. Scipio sailed back to Locri and imprisoned the 2 tribunes. He left Flaminius in charge and ordered the tribunes to be sent to Rome for trial. However, when he returned to Sicily, the humiliated Flaminius had the tribunes tortured to death, and the plundering of the city intensified. As the year passed, elections were held and new magistrates chosen. The 2 acting consuls, Scipio and Crassus, awaited the Senate to extend their command. However, the desperate Locrians sent a delegation to Rome to plead their case. After describing the terrible mistreatment they had endured under Roman occupation, the Senate erupted in anger. Scipio's enemies seized on this opportunity and unleashed a litany of allegations against him. He was accused of leaving his province without permission, allowing the discipline of his troops to degenerate, openly wearing a Greek cloak and sandals, wasting time at the gymnasium, and worst of all, reading books. It was clear that Scipio had lost focus on the invasion, and Fabius called for his recall. Luckily, his friend Quinctus Metellus, who had been appointed dictator to oversee the elections, persuaded the Senate to investigate these claims. A delegation of senators and elected officials was sent to Sicily to inspect the army and Scipio's conduct. Arriving at Locri, they imprisoned Flaminius and his accomplices. The Locrians assured the delegation that Scipio was in no way responsible for their recent misfortunes. Satisfied, they continued to Sicily and confronted the young general directly. His army and navy showed off high levels of proficiency. They put on a display of complicated maneuvers, both on land and sea. The delegation, awestruck with his level of preparation, returned to Rome satisfied. Scipio was named proconsul, and his command extended for another year. Before the invasion could finally commence, an embassy from the Numidian king Syphax arrived in Sicily. They informed Scipio that Syphax had won the War of Succession. They also informed him that the Numidians had allied with the Carthaginians when Syphax married an exceptionally beautiful daughter of Hasdrubal Gisco. Hasdrubal would organize the defenses of Carthage, and he would have the help of the Numidians. Scipio was advised to abandon his expedition and carry on his war outside Africa. However, he was not one to listen. In the summer of 204, Scipio set sail for the rich province of Emporia on the east coast of ancient Libya. His armada, however, was blown off course, and the Roman armies, numbering close to 30,000 men, landed near Utica, north of Carthage. Scipio had enough provisions for 45 days, allowing him ample time to set up a well-defensible camp. The Carthaginians sent a small cavalry raid, but it was easily defeated. Although the invasion of Africa seemed destined for years, it appears that Hasdrubal Gisco failed to prepare for that eventuality. The Carthaginian fleet was in no shape to harass the Romans, and they could freely transport plunder and resources to and from Sicily. Only when the Roman armies landed did Hasdrubal start gathering a defense force, giving the enemy valuable time to prepare. The previous year, the Numidian prince Massinissa was caught up in a war of succession. Although he briefly held the throne of eastern Numidia, he was driven out by his rival Syphax, who united the entire region under his rule. Hearing the news of the Roman arrival, Massinissa and his entourage of 200 cavalry hurried to their aid. Given their importance in the upcoming battle, it's likely that more Numidian horsemen soon followed. The Carthaginians sent another cavalry unit, numbering around 4,000 horsemen, to raid the Roman camp. However, they quickly realized they were duly outmatched and retreated to the nearby Saleca. Scipio sent Massinissa to lure out the Punic force, and they took the bait. While pursuing the Numidians, they were surrounded by Scipio and his Roman cavalry and destroyed. If Scipio had any doubts about his new ally, they were all but gone, and the Numidians were handsomely rewarded. The town of Saleca was easily captured, and large amounts of plunder were taken. By now, the Roman granaries built along the coast were overflowing. Scipio now advanced towards Utica, the largest and best defended town north of Carthage. He was hoping to make it his base of operations. Numerous siege engines were constructed, and Scipio launched attacks from both land and sea. According to our ancient sources, the attacks lasted for 40 days, but the defenders held on, inflicting heavy damage to the Romans. Hasdrubal and Syphax finally gathered their forces and moved in, forcing Scipio to call off the attacks. Both Polybius and Livy state that Hasdrubal had 30,000 foot and 3,000 horse, while Syphax had 50,000 and 10,000 respectively. While the strength of the Carthaginian army seems plausible enough, the Numidian numbers are likely exaggerated. Modern estimates put the combined force at around 54,000, still heavily outnumbering Scipio's 30 or so thousand. The two armies encamped near the Romans, but neither side was eager for an engagement. Scipio, still hoping to win over Syphax, began negotiations with the Numidian. However, he remained infatuated with his Punic wife and refused to betray his allies. Nonetheless, Syphax offered to mediate talks between the Romans and the Carthaginians. Scipio agreed and entered into negotiations with the Numidian king, but he never intended to accept the offer. Once the terms were agreed, in the spring of 203, he backed down, claiming his officers opposed the treaty. The terms proposed during these negotiations were not too dissimilar from the final terms agreed at the end of the war. The Romans would leave Africa and Hannibal would leave Italy. The current territorial gains would remain in place, confirming the Romans as masters of Hispania and the western Mediterranean at large. This has led many historians, both ancient and modern, to wonder why exactly Scipio broke off negotiations. Did he choose to pursue personal glory instead? Did he plan to further dismantle the Carthaginian Empire in order to prevent future threats from arising in Africa? Or did he simply see a glaring military weakness too tempting to ignore? It is unlikely we will ever learn the true motivation behind this decision. Scipio used this time to thoroughly survey the Carthaginian position, and once the negotiations were called off, he prepared a night attack. To maintain secrecy, the plan was withheld from the legions until the last possible moment. On the night of the attack, the army was divided into two forces. One, commanded by Gaius Laelius, was to attack the Numidian camp, while the other, under Scipio himself, would target the Carthaginians. Massinissa and his Numidians covered all escape routes from the camps. Laelius initiated the assault by setting fire to the poorly organized Numidian camp. Cramped lodgings, constructed out of reeds, easily caught fire, and the blaze quickly spread throughout the camp. Amidst this chaos, many soldiers were unaware of the Roman attack, and they were cut down while trying to extinguish the flames. Others, attempting to flee the legions, were mowed down by Massinissa. The Carthaginians, seeing the raging blaze in the allied camp, rushed in to aid them, but they too were caught off guard by the Romans. Scipio and the rest of the army then successfully set fire to the Punic camp. The attack was devastatingly successful, with most of the army perishing in the flames or cut down while trying to flee. According to ancient accounts, 40,000 men were killed and 5,000 taken prisoner. Both commanders escaped with small force. Instead of pursuing the defeated enemy and bringing the war to a swift end, Scipio returned to the siege of Utica, allowing the commanders to gather a new force. Hasdrubal and Syphax levied fresh troops and met in the area of the middle Bagradas River, known as the Great Plains. They were joined by a new army of Celtiberian warriors, numbering 4,000. In total, the two generals gathered around 30,000 troops. Upon hearing the news of this new army, Scipio left a small force to maintain the siege of Utica and rushed off to meet the Carthaginians. The exact number of troops under his command is unknown, but it is estimated to be around 20,000, making him still significantly outnumbered by his counterparts. After a swift march, Scipio reached the Punic forces. He pitched his camp close by, and following a few days of cavalry skirmishes, the two armies joined battle. The Romans deployed in the usual three-line formation, with their cavalry on the right wing and Massinissa and his Numidians on the left. Hasdrubal placed his best troops, the Celtiberians, in the center. The Carthaginians were on their right, with Syphax and his Numidians on the left. Newly raised and inexperienced Punic troops proved no match for Scipio's battle-hardened legions. The battle began with Massinissa leading a formidable charge against the Carthaginian cavalry. Seeing his onslaught, they quickly broke and fled the field, soon followed by Syphax and his horsemen. Seeing the cavalry retreat, the infantry realized the battle was over even before it had truly begun, and they too fell into a rout. The Celtiberian troops, now standing alone against the immense Roman legions, held their ground. Unfamiliar with the foreign lands of Africa, they perhaps saw no avenue of escape. The Roman second and third lines enveloped the Spaniards, and they were killed to the last man. Their sacrifice bought enough time for Hasdrubal and Syphax to escape. After this defeat, we hear no more of Hasdrubal Gisco. He likely returned to Carthage, where he was executed for his failures, a practice common in pre-Barcid times. Scipio now split his forces. Massinissa and Lelius, leading half the army, pursued Syphax into Numidia. The proconsul and the rest of the troops marched back towards Utica. Many Libyan communities, weary of the heavy taxes imposed upon them to maintain the war effort, surrendered to Scipio's advancing legions. He slowly moved down the Bagradas, gathering large amounts of plunder, finally reaching Tunis after a 2-week march. Only when he was on the Carthaginian doorstep did the authorities in the city send out their new fleet, numbering 100 warships. From his position near Tunis, Scipio could see the fleet leaving the city, and he rushed ahead of the army to prepare his men at Utica. The outnumbered Roman warships were surrounded by a wall of transport ships tied together. Losing the element of surprise, the poorly trained Punic fleet only managed to capture 60 out of the 400 transports before returning to Carthage to celebrate this minor victory. The fleet would occasionally sail out, but it would not attack the Roman position again. By now, Massinissa and Lelius had caught up with Syphax deep within Numidian territory. The king gathered a fresh force, and the two sides clashed. Although his initial cavalry charge was successful, the Romans held their ground and eventually drove the Numidians back. During the confusion, Syphax fell from his horse and he was captured on the battlefield. Following the victory, Cirta, the Numidian capital, surrendered peacefully to Massinissa. Syphax's wife, Sophonisba, the daughter of Hasdrubal, was taken together with the city. She pleaded with Massinissa not to hand her over to the Romans. Acting impulsively, he took her as his own wife. This news was most unwelcome in the Roman camp. The Romans saw Numidians as fickle allies, and close ties between Massinissa and a Carthaginian noblewoman stirred new fears. Scipio reprimanded Massinissa and claimed Sophonisba as a Roman prisoner. Stricken with grief, the young Numidian king sent his new wife a gift of poison. Brought up in the Carthaginian world, full of stories of noble suicides, Sophonisba took the poison without hesitation. To ease Massinissa's sorrows, Scipio publicly proclaimed him the king of the Numidians and showered him with royal gifts. Thus ended the only romantic episode of the war. Massinissa was sent off to deal with Vermina, Syphax's son, who was still holding out in Numidia. Scipio moved his forces to Tunis, strengthening the fortifications and making it his new base of operations. The roads to Carthage were now blocked, and provisions could no longer flow into the city. While making preparations for winter, he received word that the Carthaginians were finally ready to make peace. Having suffered 2 major defeats on home soil, the anti-war faction in the Senate finally prevailed. They agreed to recall Hannibal from Italy, but also sent 30 of their most senior members to negotiate with Scipio. The delegation threw themselves at the young general's feet, blaming Hannibal and his warmongering for starting this war. This was of course preposterous. These were the 30 most powerful men in the city, and it's more than likely that the majority of them were part of the pro-Barcid faction, but they had to shift the blame from themselves. Scipio was well aware of the 2 Barcid armies, Hannibal in Bruttium and Mago in Liguria. He was also likely aware that they had been recalled to Africa. This made him wary of the delegation, but he continued with the talks nonetheless. He too was eager to bring this war to a swift end. If Hannibal were to return, the consul currently shadowing him in Italy could follow him to Africa, where he would take over command, and with it all the glory away from Scipio. The second threat to his glory was Hannibal himself. Although he was confident in his military prowess, nothing could guarantee his victory against Rome's greatest opponent. As we have already stated, the terms agreed here were similar to the ones discussed near Utica. Hannibal and Mago would return to Africa. Carthage would renounce its claims to Spain and large islands in the Mediterranean. The Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain were added to this list. Additionally, they would also have to provide large amounts of food for Scipio's army and pay an indemnity of 5,000 silver talents. Worst of all, the Carthaginians would have to surrender all but 20 of their warships, formally ending their naval ambitions. With both sides content with this arrangement, the delegation was sent to Rome to ratify the treaty. An armistice was agreed, but Scipio refused to lift the blockade of the city, a potentially costly miscalculation. The only surviving account of the delegation's proceedings in Rome, that of Livy, is riddled with inconsistencies. He claims that the Carthaginians demanded a return to the status quo agreed at the end of the First Punic War in 241. Modern historians find this telling of events nonsensical, and in all likelihood, the Roman Senate ratified the treaty without alterations. While awaiting an answer from Rome, a large convoy carrying food from Sicily was caught in a storm and blown off course. Many of the ships ended up in the Bay of Carthage. The hungry and desperate populace demanded action from the Senate, which sent out the fleet to recover abandoned ships and haul them into the city. Furious, Scipio dispatched 3 envoys to demand the return of the ships and their cargo. However, Hannibal and his veterans had by then already sailed out from Italy and landed near Hadrumetum, where he started organizing a new army. The mood in Carthage was shifting, and calls for war were renewed once more. The envoys barely escaped with their lives, and hostilities resumed. Scipio was furious about the breakdown in talks, and he initiated an increasingly brutal campaign. Even communities that surrendered without a fight were enslaved and plundered. This harsh treatment prompted the authorities in Carthage to push Hannibal into a quick battle. However, he knew that his cavalry was heavily outnumbered and refused to act rashly. It's not clear why Scipio didn't attack him immediately after learning of his landing in Africa, but the Punic general was allowed time to consolidate his forces. The rest of 203 and early 202 was spent gathering and training troops. Remnants of Mago's force from Liguria returned to Carthage and joined up with Hannibal. Mago had died from his wounds while en route, leaving Hannibal as the sole surviving son of the great Hamilcar Barca. Hannibal hired new mercenaries and for the first time in the war levied Carthaginian citizens, a clear sign that they were in a desperate situation. He also persuaded one of Syphax's relatives to join him with 2,000 cavalry, doubling his numbers. Back in Rome, both newly elected consuls of 202 were hoping to be appointed to Africa to take over command, but Scipio and his allies still held sway in the Senate. The question was deferred to the people, who overwhelmingly voted to extend Scipio's imperium. However, one of the consuls, Tiberius Claudius Nero, a cousin of the former consul who had won a victory against Hasdrubal, was sent with the fleet to Africa and ordered to support Scipio from the sea. With threats from home subdued, Scipio could now pay full attention to the task at hand. Leading the bulk of his forces, Scipio continued ravaging Libya. He constantly sent messengers to Massinissa, demanding that he and his forces join up with the Romans. His campaign against Vermina was taking longer than expected. Eventually, in late October of 202, Hannibal moved from his camp in pursuit of the Romans. They met near Zama, an inland city 5 days' march from Carthage. Hannibal sent 3 spies to survey the Roman position, but they were captured. Instead of facing death, they were taken on a tour of the Roman camp in order to report what they saw to Hannibal. Considering Massinissa hadn't yet arrived, they would report seeing no Numidians, giving the Punic general false hopes. In the following days, the two generals agreed to a parley. Finally, after all these years, the two greatest military leaders of their generation met face to face. The veracity of this meeting is sometimes questioned. It was very unusual for the generals in the ancient world to meet before the battle. But considering it was reported by most of the ancient writers covering the period, including Polybius, it's likely that it had indeed occurred. Both men knew Greek, but adhering to ancient formalities, they spoke in their native languages through interpreters. Livy, in his usual manner, embellished their speeches, but a common through line can be seen in all accounts. Hannibal offered previously agreed territorial concessions, but failed to mention either the large indemnity or the Punic fleet. This was of course rejected by Scipio, who ended the negotiations saying, "Either hand over control over yourselves and your country, or fight and win." A day before the parley, Massinissa arrived with 4,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry, meaning Scipio was finally ready for battle. The next day, the two armies marched out in full force and the battle was joined. Polybius, aware of the momentousness of the situation, described it in the following terms. "Never did two braver armies or two more successful and brilliant generals contend, or fortune hold out a more splendid prize, the mastery of not only Africa and Europe, but every land known to history." The exact numbers are unknown. Scipio likely had around 20,000 heavy infantry and 1,500 cavalry, supported by Massinissa and his 10,000 men. The Romans were deployed in the usual three-line formation, with the Italian cavalry under Laelius on the left and the Numidians on the right. The usually staggered Roman lines were aligned, creating openings between the maniples. These gaps were filled by light skirmishers. This army is likely the best trained Roman army before the introduction of professional soldiers in the following centuries. Part of the army was made up of survivors from Cannae, who served continuously for 14 long years. The rest were volunteers who arrived in Sicily in 205. For more than 3 years, they trained and campaigned together under arguably the greatest of all Roman generals. They were more than a match for Rome's greatest enemy. Hannibal reportedly had around 50,000 men and 80 war elephants on his side. Taking a page from the Roman playbook, he deployed his troops in a similar three-line formation. Hannibal lacked sufficient time to train and fully integrate new soldiers into his army. This three-line formation allowed each section of the army to operate independently, reducing friction between the unfamiliar troops. The first line, numbering 12,000 men, consisted of Ligurians, Gauls and Balearic slingers, the remnants of Mago's army. The second line, of roughly equal size, was made up from freshly conscripted Libyan and Carthaginian troops. The veterans that crossed from Italy, roughly equal in number to the Roman heavy troops, meaning around 20,000, were placed in the last line. They included Bruttian and Lucanian mercenaries, and more importantly, the Spanish and African troops who had followed Hannibal across the Alps all those years ago. This last line is sometimes referred to as the most experienced army in world history. For 16 long years, they followed Hannibal from Spain, across southern Gaul and over the Alps. They campaigned in Italy, from Trebia over Trasimene to Cannae. They easily destroyed everything that the Roman state threw against them. These men and their general did not know defeat. Hannibal placed his Numidian cavalry on the left, opposite Massinissa, and his Carthaginian cavalry on the right, opposite Laelius and the Romans. Numbering around 4,000, for the first time in the war, his cavalry was heavily outnumbered by the Romans. 80 war elephants were placed in front of the first line. Hannibal gave the signal, and the battle began with an elephant charge. Seeing the large beasts approaching, the Roman trumpets sounded in unison, signaling the start of the attack. This sudden loud sound frightened the poorly trained elephants, and some on the left flank turned around and fled. As they rampaged away from the battle, they crashed into Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, causing mass confusion. Seizing the opportunity, Massinissa charged his countrymen, easily routing them. The rest of the elephants continued advancing towards the Roman line. Seeing their approach, the skirmishers moved aside, opening the gaps between maniples. The elephants, unwilling to crash into a solid wall of men, swerved into the open lanes. They were met with a barrage of javelins from all sides, and a large number of elephants and their crews were quickly killed. Turning to flee, the elephants charged towards Hannibal's right flank, again crashing into the cavalry. Laelius, not to be outdone by his Numidian counterpart, charged the Carthaginian cavalry and drove them from the field. Some authors, inclined towards Hannibal, claim this was done deliberately to draw away the numerically superior Roman cavalry. However, the same outcome might have been achieved with far less chaos by leaving out the elephant charge. In reality, Scipio's masterful positioning proved crucial in these opening stages. Now, with the elephants gone and the Roman cavalry in hot pursuit of their Carthaginian counterparts, the Carthaginian first two lines advanced, with the veterans ordered to hold back. A desperate fight ensued, with both sides attacking with great ferocity. The Hastati in the first line were unable to break the mercenaries on their own, and they were eventually joined by the Principes. The two Roman lines, now working together, managed to finally break the Carthaginian resolve, and first the mercenaries and then the conscripts fell into a rout. Already exhausted, the Romans rushed after the fleeing enemy, breaking formation. Hannibal's veterans, unperturbed by the flight of their comrades, looked on from a distance. The rough terrain, now littered with corpses, made it impossible to maintain formation, and Hannibal waited for the Romans to come out to him. Amidst this chaos, Scipio sounded his trumpets. In a display of remarkable discipline, the Hastati fell back to reform the line. Abandoning the three-line deployment, Scipio placed the Hastati in the center, with the Principes and fresh Triarii on their flanks. After 16 long years of war and countless casualties on both sides, it had all come down to this: two solid lines of troops marching towards each other. Roughly equal in size and equally equipped, with Hannibal's veterans wearing Roman armor, there was no clear favorite. With the war, and more importantly their lives on the line, the two sides fought desperately. Heavy casualties were inflicted, but neither side could gain an advantage. It seemed like the fighting could go on indefinitely. However, Scipio had one final trick up his sleeve. Laelius and Massinissa, having chased off the Carthaginians, gathered their forces and charged back towards the field of battle. A sudden onslaught of the cavalry from the rear was enough to break the veterans, and in a move akin to Hannibal's, the Carthaginians were encircled and cut down. In the final act of irony, the survivors of Cannae, Rome's greatest defeat, inflicted the greatest and final defeat on Hannibal and Carthage as a whole. According to Polybius, the Carthaginians lost 20,000 men, with as many captured. On the other hand, the Romans lost 1,500, mostly in the center, a clear sign of a desperate struggle between the two armies. Following the battle, Hannibal fled to Hadrumetum, and from there, after 36 long years, returned to Carthage. Scipio gathered the prisoners and spoils and marched back to his camp near Utica. He sent Laelius to report the news of this victory to the Roman Senate. Scipio then sent his army and navy to encircle Carthage in a display of force. Although utterly defeated, Carthage was still one of the best fortified towns of antiquity, and the Roman army had no hopes of taking it. Well aware of this, Scipio agreed to meet with the delegation to discuss terms. He met with the same 30 senators, and after a stern lesson about treachery, laid out his terms. All prisoners and deserters were to be returned without ransom. All war elephants had to be handed over, and the fleet was reduced to only 10 triremes. Carthage could keep its African territory, but had to recognize Massinissa and his substantially enlarged kingdom. They would also have to pay an indemnity of 10,000 silver talents, or around 350 metric tons, over the following 50 years. Carthage was forbidden from waging war outside of Africa, and within Africa only with Roman permission. Additionally, they had to provide food and pay for Scipio's army while they waited for the treaty to be ratified in Rome. The message was clear: Carthage would become one of Rome's client states. Some of the proud senators wanted to reject the treaty, but Hannibal, ever the realist, urged them to accept their fate. Finally, seeing the reality of their situation, the Senate agreed to the imposed terms. With winter setting in, a delegation could not be immediately sent to Rome. It was only in late February or early March that they finally embarked. This delay caused unforeseen friction at the final hour. Winter of 201 was apparently so severe that it postponed the consular elections until after the Ides of March, the usual start of the consular year. The delegation had to wait out the election, and once new consuls were chosen, fresh problems sprang up. One of the consuls, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus, sought to hijack the African campaign and take the credit for the conquest of Carthage. He went further than his predecessors, even blocking the Senate from discussing the peace treaty. Ultimately, the tribunes of the plebs had to step in and force the Senate to ratify the treaty. A delegation of priests and senators was sent to Carthage to conduct the proper peace ceremony. Finally, in early 201, war that had raged on for 17 long years and ravaged large parts of Italy, Spain, Sicily, and North Africa was brought to an end. According to some accounts, over 300,000 Italian troops perished in the conflict, along with countless more Africans, Spaniards, and Gauls. No fewer than 4,000 Roman prisoners were released, deserters and elephants were handed over, and according to Livy, as many as 500 ships were sailed out of the harbor and put to the torch. As the Carthaginians watched on from the city, the realization finally sank in. Once the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean, Carthage was now no more than a shadow of its former self. Lastly, the Carthaginians handed over 350 talents of silver as payment for the plundered fleet, and the Romans departed for home. Most of the army sailed directly for Rome, but Scipio and a small escort disembarked at Lilybaeum. From there, he marched to Rome in a victorious procession, visiting numerous towns along the way. As he passed through the Italian countryside, the exhausted communities erupted in celebrations. Scipio was awarded the magnificent triumph in Rome. According to Livy, this triumph was the most splendid ever seen in Rome. Scipio personally sponsored several days of festivities, including races, gladiatorial combats, and plays. His men bestowed upon him a lasting nickname, Africanus, the man of Africa. Although his adopted grandson also used this epithet, it is by custom reserved solely for the victor of Zama. Following the end of the war, Hannibal stayed in control of the army, as the authorities in Carthage feared a repeat of the truceless war. In 199, when the threat of mutiny was removed, he stepped down. Although defeated, Hannibal still held some sway in the city, and he was elected suffet in 196. In this position, he tried to implement radical reforms, aiming to reorganize finances and eliminate corruption. This did not sit well with the oligarchs and the Council of Judges, who repeatedly petitioned Rome to have him removed. Although Scipio opposed intervention in their internal affairs, a delegation was sent to Carthage. Realizing he had no chance of peace at home, Hannibal went into voluntary exile. He joined the court of the Seleucid king Antiochus III in Ephesus. According to one ancient source, Scipio was sent to Ephesus as a part of delegation to Antiochus. There the two great rivals met again. During one of their meetings, Scipio asked Hannibal who the greatest generals in history were, and he named Alexander the Great, Pyrrhus of Epirus, and himself, in that order. Amused, Scipio asked what he would say if he had won at Zama. Hannibal replied that he would place himself as the greatest general in history. This episode is most likely a later invention, as Scipio was not part of a delegation to Antiochus. However, it shows the respect Roman writers had for Hannibal's military genius. Hannibal spent the rest of his life moving between the royal courts in Anatolia, evading capture by the Romans. He died in 183. His rival Scipio enjoyed unparalleled popularity at home. Only 34 at the time, he was the foremost citizen of the Republic and the princeps senatus, or the first senator. However, Scipio had his enemies in Rome. His chief opponent, Fabius Maximus, died in 203 and was succeeded by Marcus Porcius Cato, better known as Cato the Elder. A staunch conservative, Cato was vehemently opposed to Scipio's open Hellenization. A better military leader than politician, Scipio struggled to direct policies in the city. Although he was elected as censor and later as consul, he was often undermined by the Senate. His trusted advisor, Laelius, lost his consular election, and his brother Lucius was elected only in 190, 12 years after Zama. In the end, Scipio would share the fate of his greatest rival. Amidst a corruption scandal, Scipio abandoned Rome and retired to his country estate, where he also died in 183. In the aftermath of the Second Punic War, the Roman Republic was the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. It controlled lands from Spain in the west to the Adriatic in the east. Various peoples, including Italians, Greeks, Gauls, Iberians, and many others, were incorporated into a unified state with central authority. Although Rome was still governed as a republic, the first traces of an empire can be found during this post-war period. The era of aggressive expansion was about to kick into high gear. Once the magnificent riches started pouring into the city, all hopes of controlling the victorious generals were gone. Julius Caesar is often blamed for the death of the republic, but Rome became an empire long before it officially had an emperor. We would like to thank our generous patrons. Without their help, we wouldn't be able to make these longer videos. If you want to support us and help us choose the topic for the next short history video, consider joining us on Patreon.